Chapter 9 of Lad, a Dog by Albert Payson Terhune. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Greg Giordano. Chapter 9 Speaking of Utility. The man huddled frowsily in the tree crotch, like a rumpled and sick raccoon. At times he would crane his thin neck and peer about him, but more as if he feared rescue than as though he hoped for it. Then, before slumping back to his sick raccoon pose, he would look murderously earthward and swear with lurid fervor. At the tree foot the big dog wasted neither time nor energy in frantic barking or in capering excitedly about. Instead, he lay at majestic ease, gazing up toward the treed man with grave attentiveness. Thus, for a full half-hour, the two had remained, the treer and the treed. Thus, from present signs, they would continue to remain until Christmas. There is, by tradition, something intensely comic in the picture of a man treed by a dog. The man, in the present case, supplied the only element of comedy in the scene. The dog was anything but comic, either in looks or in posture. He was a collie, huge of bulk, massive of shoulder, deep and shaggy of chest. His forepaws were snowy and absurdly small. His eyes were seal-dark and sorrowful, eyes that proclaimed not only an uncannily wise brain, but a soul as well. In brief, he was Lad, official guard of the place's safety. It was in this rôle of guard that he was now serving as jailer to the man he had seen slouching through the undergrowth of the forest, which grew close up to the place's outbuildings. From his two worshipped deities, the mistress and the master, Lad had learned in puppyhood the simple provisions of the guest law. He knew, for example, that no one openly approaching the house along the driveway from the furlong-distant highroad was to be molested. Such a visitor's advent, especially at night, might lawfully be greeted by a salvo of barks, but the barks were a mere announcement, not a threat. On the other hand, the law demanded the instant halting of all prowlers, or of anyone seeking to get to the house from road or lake by circuitous and stealthy means. Such roundabout methods spell trespass. Every good watchdog knows that. But wholly good watchdogs are far fewer than most people, even their owners, realize. Lad was one of the few. Today's trespasser had struck into the place's grounds from an adjoining bit of woodland. He had moved softly and obliquely, and had made little furtive dashes from one bit of cover to another, as he advanced toward the outbuildings 100 yards north of the house. He had moved cleverly and quietly. No human had seen or heard him. Even Lad, sprawling half asleep on the veranda, had not seen him. For, in spite of theory, a dog's eye by daylight is not so keen or so far-seeing as is a human's. But the wind had brought news of a foreign presence on the place, a presence which Lad's hasty glance at driveway and lake edge did not verify. So the dog had risen to his feet, stretched himself, collie fashion, fore and aft, and trotted quickly away to investigate. Scent and then sound taught him which way to go. 2 minutes later he changed his wolf trot to a slow and unwontedly stiff-legged walk, advancing with head lowered and growling softly far down in his throat. He was making straight for a patch of sumac, 10 feet in front of him and 100 feet behind the stables. Now, when a dog bounds towards a man, barking, with head up, there is nothing at all to be feared from his approach. But when the pace slackens to a stiff walk and his head sinks low, that is a very good time indeed for the object of his attentions to think seriously of escape or of defense. Instinct or experience must have imparted this useful truth to the lurker in the sumac patch. For as the great dog drew near, the man incontinently wheeled and broke cover. At the same instant Lad charged. The man had a 10-foot start. This vantage he utilized by flinging himself bodily at a low forked hickory tree directly in his path. Up the rough trunk to the crotch he shinned with the speed of a chased cat. Lad arrived at the tree bole barely in time to collect a mouthful of cloth from the climber's left trouser ankle, after which, since he was not of the sort to clamor noisily for what lurked beyond his reach, the dog yawned and lay down to keep guard on his arboreal prisoner. For half an hour he lay thus, varying his vigil once or twice by sniffing thoughtfully at a ragged scrap of trouser cloth between his little white forepaws. He sniffed the thing as though trying to commit its scent to memory. The man did not seek help by shouting. Instead, he seemed oddly willing that no other human should intrude on his sorry plight. A single loud yell would have brought aid from the stables, or from the house, or even from the lodge up by the gate. Yet, though the man must have guessed this, he did not yell. Instead, he cursed whisperingly at intervals and snarled at his captor. At last, his nerve going, the prisoner drew out a jackknife, opened a blade at each end of it, and hurled the ugly missile with all its force at the dog. As the man had shifted his position to get at the knife, Lad had risen expectantly to his feet, with some hope that his captive might be going to descend. It was lucky for Lad that he was standing when the knife was thrown, for the aim was not bad, and a dog lying down cannot easily dodge. A dog standing on all fours is different, especially if he is a collie. Lad sprang to one side instinctively. As the thrower's arm went back, the knife whizzed harmless into the sumac patch. Lad's teeth bared themselves in something that looked like a smile, and was not. Then he lay down again on guard. A minute later he was up with a jump. From the direction of the house came a shrill whistle, followed by a shout of "Lad! Lad!" It was the master calling him. The summons could not be ignored. Usually it was obeyed with eager gladness, but now Lad looked worriedly up into the tree. Then, coming to a decision, he galloped away at top speed. In 10 seconds he was at the veranda where the master stood talking with a newly arrived guest. Before the master could speak to the dog, Lad rushed up to him, whimpering in stark appeal, then ran a few steps toward the stables, paused, looked back, and whimpered again. "What's the matter with him?" loudly demanded the guest, an obese and elderly man, right sportily attired. "What ails the silly dog?" "He's found something," said the master. "Something he wants me to come and see, and he wants me to come in a hurry." "How do you know?" asked the guest. "Because I know his language as well as he knows mine," retorted the master. He set off in the wake of the excited dog. The guest followed in more leisurely fashion, complaining. "Of all the idiocy! To let a measly dog drag you out of the shade on a red-hot day like this, just to look at some dead chipmunk he's found." "Perhaps," stiffly agreed the master, not slackening his pace. "But if Lad behaves like that, unless it's pretty well worth while, he's changed a lot in the past hour. A man can do worse sometimes than follow a tip his dog gives him." "Have it your own way," grinned the guest. "Perhaps he may lead us to a treasure cave, or to a damsel in distress. I'm with you." "Guy me if it amuses you," said the master. "It does," his guest informed him. "It amuses me to see any grown man think so much of a dog as you people think of Lad. It's maudlin." "My house is the only one within a mile on this side of the lake that has never been robbed," was the master's reply. "My stable is the only one in the same radius that hasn't been rifled by harness and tire thieves. Thieves who seem to do their work in broad daylight, too, when the stables won't be locked. I have Lad to thank for all that. The dog had darted far ahead. Now he was standing beneath the low-forked hickory tree, staring up into it. "He's treed a cat!" guffawed the guest, his laugh as irritating as a kick. "Extra! Come out and get a nice sunstroke, folks. Come and see the cat Lad has treed." The master did not answer. There was no cat in the tree. There was nothing visible in the tree. Lad's aspect shrank from hope to depression. He looked apologetically at the master. Then he began to sniff once more at a scrap of cloth on the ground. The master picked up the cloth and presently walked over to the tree. From a jut of bark dangled a shred of the same cloth. The master's hand went to Lad's head in approving caress. "It was not a cat," he said. "It was a man. See the rags of—" "Oh, piffle!" snorted the guest. "Next you'll be reconstructing the man's middle name and favorite perfume from the color of the bark on the tree. You people are always telling about wonderful stunts of Lad's, and that's all the evidence there generally is to it." "No, Mr. Glure," denied the master, taking a strangle-hold on his temper. "No, that's not quite all the evidence that we have for our brag about Lad. For instance, we had the evidence of your own eyes when he herded that flock of stampeded prize sheep for you last spring, and of your own eyes again when he won the Gold Hat Cup at the Labor Day Dog Show. No, there's plenty of evidence that Lad is worth his salt. Let it go at that. Shall we get back to the house? It's fairly cool on the veranda. By the way, what was it you wanted me to call Lad for? You asked to see him, and—" "Why, here's the idea," explained Glure, as they made their way through the heat back to the shade of the porch. "It's what I drove over here to talk with you about. I'm making the rounds of all this region. And say, I didn't ask to see Lad. I asked if you still had him. I asked because—" "Oh," apologized the master. "I thought you wanted to see him. Most people ask to if he doesn't happen to be around, when they call. I asked you if you still had him," expounded Mr. Glure, "because I hoped you hadn't. I hoped you were more of a patriot." "Patriot?" echoed the master, puzzled. "Yes, that's why I'm making this tour of the country, to rouse dog owners to a sense of their duty. I've just formed a local branch of the Food Conservation League, and—" "It's a splendid organization," warmly approved the master. "But what have dog owners to—" "To do with it?" supplemented Glure. "They have nothing to do with it, more's the pity. But they ought to. That's why I volunteered to make this canvass. It was my own idea. Some of the others were foolish enough to object. But as I had founded and financed this Hampton branch of the League—" "What canvass are you talking about?" asked the master, who was far too familiar with Glure's ways to let the man become fairly launched on a paean of self-adulation. "You say it's to rouse dog owners to a sense of their duty. Along what line? We dogmen have raised a good many $1,000 this past year by our Red Cross shows and by our subscriptions to all sorts of war funds. The Blue Cross, too, and the Collie Ambulance Fund have—" "This is something better than the mere giving of surplus coin," broke in Glure. "It is something that involves sacrifice, a needful sacrifice for our country, a sacrifice that may win the war." "Count me in on it, then," cordially approved the master. "Count in all real dogmen. What is the sacrifice?" "It's my own idea," modestly boasted Glure, adding, "that is, of course, it's been agitated by other people in letters to newspapers, and all that. But I'm the first to go out and put it into actual effect." "Shoot," suggested the weary master. "That's the very word!" exclaimed Glure. "That's the very thing I want dog owners to combine in doing. To shoot." "To what?" "To shoot, or poison, or asphyxiate," expounded Glure, warming to his theme. "In short, to get rid of every dog." The master's jaw swung ajar and his eyes bulged. His face began to assume an unbecoming, pricky hue. Glure went on. "You see, neighbor, our nation is up against it. When war was declared last month it found us unprepared. We've got to pitch in and economize. Every mouthful of food wasted here is a new lease of life to the Kaiser. We're cutting down on sugar and meat and fat, but for every cent we save that way we're throwing away $1 in feeding our dogs that are a useless, senseless, costless luxury. They serve no utilitarian end. They eat food that belongs to soldiers. I'm trying to brighten the corner where I am by persuading my neighbors to get rid of their dogs. When I've proved what a blessing it is, I'm going to inaugurate a nationwide campaign from California to New York, from—" "Hold on!" snapped the Master, finding some of his voice, and, in the same effort, mislaying much of his temper. "What wall-eyed idiocy do you think you're trying to talk? How many dogmen do you expect to convert to such a crazy doctrine? Have you tried any others, or am I the first mark?" "I'm sorry you take it this way," reproved Glure. "I had hoped you were more broad-minded, but you are as pig-headed as the rest." "The rest, eh?" The Master caught him up. "The rest? Then I'm not the first? I'm glad they had sense enough to send you packing." "They were blind animal worshippers, both of them," said Glure aggrievedly. "Just as you are. One of them yelled something after me that I sincerely hope I didn't hear aright. If I did, I have a strong action for slander against him. The other chucklehead so far forgot himself as to threaten to take a shotgun to me if I didn't get off his land." "I'm sorry," sighed the Master, "for both of them seem to have covered the ground so completely that there isn't anything unique for me to say or do. Now listen to me for 2 minutes. I've read a few of those anti-dog letters in the newspapers, but you're the first person I've met in real life who backs such rot, and I'm going—" "It is not a matter for argument," loftily began Glure. "Yes, it is," asserted the Master. "Everything is, except religion and love and toothache. You say dogs ought to be destroyed as a patriotic duty because they aren't utilitarian. That's where you're wrong at the very beginning. Dead wrong. I'm not talking about the big kennels where one man keeps 100 dogs as he'd herd so many prize hogs. Though look what the owners of such kennels did for the country at the last New York show at Madison Square Garden. Every penny of the thousands and thousands of dollars in profits from the show went to the Red Cross. I'm speaking of the man who keeps 1 dog or 2 or even 3 dogs and keeps them as pets. I'm speaking of myself, if you like. Do you know what it costs me per week to feed my dogs?" "I am not looking for statistics, and—" "No, I suppose not. Few fanatics are. Well, I figured it out a few weeks ago, after I read one of those anti-dog letters. The total upkeep of all my dogs averages just under $1 a week. A bare $50 a year. That's true. And—" "And that's $50," interposed Glure eagerly, "would pay for a soldier's—" "It would not," contradicted the Master, trying to keep some slight grip on his sliding temper. "But I can tell you what it would do. Part of it would go for burglar insurance, which I don't need now, because no stranger dares to sneak up to my house at night. Part of it would go to make up for things stolen around the place. For instance, in the harness room of my stable there are 5 sets of good harness and 2 or 3 extra automobile tires. Unless I'm very much mistaken, the best of those would be gone now if Lad hadn't just treed the man who was after them." "Pshaw!" exploded Glure in fine scorn. "We saw no man there. There was no proof of—" "There was proof enough for me," continued the Master. "And if Lad hadn't scented the fellow out, one of the other dogs would. As I told you, mine is the only house, and mine is the only stable, on this side of the lake that has never been looted. Mine is the only orchard, and mine is the only garden that is never robbed. And this is the only place, on our side of the lake, where dogs are kept at large for 12 months of the year. My dogs' entry fees at Red Cross shows have more than paid for their keep, and those fees went straight to a charity." "But—" "The women of my family are as safe here, day and night, as if I had a machine-gun company on guard. That assurance counts for more than a little in peace of mind back here in the North Jersey hinterland. I'm not taking into account the several other ways the dogs bring in cash income to us, and even the cash Lad turned over to the Red Cross when we sent that $1,600 gold hat cup he won, to be melted down. And I'm not speaking of our dogs' comradeship, and what that means to us. Our dogs are an asset in every way, not a liability. They aren't deadheads either, for I pay the state tax on them every year. They're true, loyal, companionable chums, and they're an ornament to the place, as well as its best safeguard. All in return for table scraps and skim milk and less than a weekly dollar's worth of stale bread and cast-off butcher shop bones. Where do you figure out the saving for the war chest if I got rid of them?" "As I said," repeated Glure with cold austerity, "it's not a matter for argument. I came here hoping to—" "I'm not given to mawkish sentiment," went on the Master shamefacedly. "But on the day your fool law for dog exterminating goes into effect, there'll be a piteous cry of little children all over the whole world, of little children mourning for the gentle protecting playmates they loved, and there'll be a million men and women whose lives have all at once become lonely and empty and miserable. Isn't this war causing enough crying and loneliness and misery without your adding to it by killing our dogs? For the matter of that, haven't the army dogs over in Europe been doing enough for mankind to warrant a square deal for their stay-at-home brothers? Haven't they?" "That's a mass of sentimental bosh," declared Glure. "All of it." "It is," willingly confessed the Master. "So are most of the worthwhile things in life, if you reduce them to their lowest terms." "You know what a fine group of dogs I had," said Glure, starting off on a new tack. "I had a group that cost me, dog for dog, more than any other kennel in the state. Grand dogs, too. You remember my wonderful Merle, for instance, and—" "And your rare Prussian sheep-dog? Or was it a prune hound that a Chicago man sold to you for $1,100? supplemented the Master, swallowing a grin. "I remember them all. What then?" "Well," resumed Glure, "no one can accuse me of not practicing what I preach. I began this splendid campaign by getting rid of every dog I owned. So I—" "Yes," agreed the Master. "I read all about that last month in your local paper. Distemper had run through your kennel, and you tried doctoring the dogs on a theory of your own, instead of sending for a vet. So they all died. Tough luck. Or perhaps you got rid of them that way on purpose, for the good of the cause? I'm sorry about the Merle. He was—" "I see there's no use talking to you," sighed Glure in disgust, ponderously rising and waddling toward his car. "I'm disappointed, because I hoped you were less bone-brained and more patriotic than those yokels around here." "I'm not," cheerily conceded the Master. "I'm not. I'm glad to say, not a bit." "Then," pursued Glure, climbing into the car, "since you feel that way about it, I suppose there's no use asking you to come to the little cattle show I'm organizing for week after next? Because that's for the Food Conservation League, too. And since you're so out of sympathy with—" "I'm not out of sympathy with the League," asserted the Master. "Its card is in our kitchen window. We've signed its pledge, and we're boosting it in every way we know how, except by killing our dogs, and that's no part of the League's program, as you know very well. Tell me more about the cattle show." "It's a neighborhood affair," said Glure sulkily, yet eager to secure any possible entrance. "Just a bunch of home-raised cattle, cup and rosette for best of each recognized breed, and the usual ribbons for second and third. $3 an entry, only one class for each breed. Every entrant must have been raised by the exhibitor. Gate admission 50 cents. Red Cross to get the gross proceeds. I've offered the use of my south meadow at Glure Towers, just as I did for the specialty dog show. I've put up $100 toward the running expenses, too. Bickleson's to judge." "I don't go in for stock raising," said the Master. "My little Alderney heifer is the only head of quality stock I ever bred. I doubt if she is worth taking up there. But I'll be glad to take her, if only to swell the competition list. Send me a blank, please." Lad trotted dejectedly back to the house as Glure's car chugged away up the drive. Lad was glumly unhappy. He had had no trouble at all in catching the scent of the man he had treed. He had followed the crashingly made trail through undergrowth and woodland until it had emerged into the highroad. And there, perforce, Lad had paused. For, taught from puppyhood, he knew the boundaries of the place as well as he did the mistress or the master. And he knew equally well that his own jurisdiction ended at those boundaries. Beyond them he might not chase even the most loathed intruder. The highroad was sanctuary. Wherefore at the road edge he stopped and turned slowly back. His pursuit was ended, but not his anger, nor his memory of the marauder's scent. The man had trespassed slyly on the place. He had gotten away unpunished. These things rankled in the big dog's mind. It was a pretty little cattle show, and staged in a pretty setting withal, at Glure Towers 2 weeks later. The big sunken meadow on the verge of the Ramapo River was lined on 2 sides with impromptu sheds. The third side was blocked by something between a grandstand and a marquee. The tree-hung river bordered the fourth side. In the field center was the roped-off judging enclosure into which the cattle, class by class, were to be led. Above the pastoral scene brooded the architectural crime known as the Towers, homestead and stronghold of Hamilcar Q. Glure, Esquire. Glure had made much money in Wall Street, a crooked little street that begins with a graveyard and ends in a river. Having waxed indecently rich, he had erected for himself a hideously expensive estate among the Ramapo Mountains, and had settled down to the task of patronizing his rural neighbors. There he elected to be known as the Wall Street Farmer, a title that delighted not only himself but everyone else in the region. There was, in this hinterland stretch, a friendly and constant rivalry among the natives and other old residents in the matter of stock raising. Horses, cattle, pigs, chickens, even a very few sheep were bred for generations along lines which their diverse owners had laid out, lines which those owners fervently believed must some day produce perfection. Each owner or group of owners had his own special ideas as to the best way to produce the super stock result. The local stock shows formed the only means of proving or disproving the excellence of the varied theories. Hence these shows were looked upon as barnyard supreme courts. Mr. Glure had begun his career in the neighborhood with a laudable aim of excelling everybody else in everything. He had gone, heart and soul, into stock producing, and as he had no breeding theories of his own, he proceeded to acquire a set. As it would necessarily take years to work out these beliefs, he bridged the gap neatly by purchasing and importing prize livestock, and by entering it against the home-raised products of his neighbors. Strangely enough, this did not add to the popularity which he did not possess. Still more strangely, it did not add materially to his prestige as an exhibitor, for the judges had an exasperating way of handing him a second or third prize ribbon, and then of awarding the coveted blue rosette to the owner and breeder of some local exhibit. After a long time it began to dawn upon Glure that narrow neighborhood prejudice deemed it unsportsmanlike to buy prize stock and exhibit it as one's own. At approximately the same time 3 calves were born to newly imported prize cows in the 2-acre model barns of Glure Towers, and with them was born Glure's newest idea. No one could deny he had bred these calves himself. They were born on his own place and of his own high pedigreed cattle. 3 breeds were represented among the trio of specimens. By points and by lineage they were well nigh peerless. Wherefore the plan for a show of neighborhood home-raised cattle. At length Glure felt he was coming into his own. The hinterland folk had fought shy of Glure since the dog show wherein he had sought to win the capital prize by formulating a set of conditions that could be filled by no entrant except a newly imported champion merle of his own. But the phrase home-raised now proved a bait that few of the region's stock lovers could resist, and on the morning of the show no fewer than 52 cattle of standard breeds were shuffling or lowing in the big impromptu sheds. A farm hand, the day before, had led to the show ground the place's sole entrant, the pretty little Alderney heifer, of which the master had spoken to Glure, and which, by the way, was destined to win nothing higher than a third prize ribbon. For that matter, to end the suspense, the best of the 3 Glure calves won only a second prize, all the first for their 3 breeds going to non-plutocratic North Jerseymen, who had bred the ancestors of their entrants for 6 generations. The mistress and the master motored over to Glure Towers on the morning of the show in their one car. Lad went with them. He always went with them. Not that any dog could hope to find interest in a cattle show, but a dog would rather go anywhere with his master than to stay at home without him. Witness the glad alacrity wherewith the weariest dog deserts a snug fireside in the vilest weather for the joy of a master accompanying walk. A tire puncture delayed the trip. The show was about to begin when the car was at last parked behind the sunken meadow. The mistress and the master, with Lad at their heels, started across the meadow afoot towards the well-filled grandstand. Several acquaintances in the stand waved to them as they advanced. Also, before they had traversed more than half the meadow's area, their host bore down upon them. Mr. Glure, dressed as usual for the occasion, looked like a blend of Landseer's Edinburgh Drover and a theatre program picture of What the Man Will Wear. He had been walking beside a garishly livered groom who was leading an enormous Holstein bull toward the judging enclosure. The bull was steered by a 5-foot bar, the end snapped to a ring in his nose. "Hello, good people!" Mr. Glure boomed, pump-handling the unenthusiastic mistress's right hand, and bestowing a jarringly annoying slap upon the master's shoulder. "Glad to see you. You're late. Almost too late for the best part of the show. Before judging begins, I'm having some of my choicest European stock paraded in the ring. Just for exhibition, you know. Not for a contest. I like to give a treat to some of these farmers who think they know how to breed cattle." "Yes?" queried the master, who could think of nothing cleverer to say. "Take that bull, Tenebris, of mine, for instance," proclaimed Glure, with a wave toward the approaching Holstein and his guide. "Best ton of livestock that ever stood on 4 legs. Look how he—" Glure paused in his lecture, for he saw that both the mistress and the master were staring, not at the bull, but at the beast's leader. The spectacle of a groom in gaudy livery, on duty at a cattle show, was all but too much for their gravity. "You're looking at that boy of mine, eh? Fine, well set up chap, isn't he? A faithful boy, devoted to me, slavishly devoted. Not like most of these grumpy, independent Jersey rustics. Not much. He's a treasure, Winston is. Used to be chief handler for some of the biggest cattle breeders in the East, he tells me. I got hold of him by chance, and just by the sheerest good luck, a week or so ago. Met him on the road, and he asked for a lift. It was then that Lad disgraced himself and his deities, and proved himself all unworthy to appear in so refined an assembly. The man in livery had convoyed the bull to within a few feet of the proudly exhorting Glure. Now, without growl or other sign of warning, the hitherto peaceable dog changed into a murder machine. In a single mighty bound he cleared the narrowing distance between himself and the advancing groom. The leap sent him hurtling through the air, an 80-pound fury catapult, straight for the man's throat. Over and beyond the myriad cattle odors, Lad had suddenly recognized a scent that spelt deathless hatred. The scent had been verified by a single glance at the brilliantly clad man in livery, wherefore the mad charge. The slashing jaws missed their mark in the man's throat by a bare half-inch. That they missed it at all was because the man also recognized Lad, and shrank back in mortal terror. Even before the 80-pound weight smashing against his chest sent the groom sprawling backward to the ground, Lad's slashing jaws had found a hold in place of the one they had missed. This grip was on the liveried shoulder, into which the fangs sank to their depth. Down went the man, screaming, the dog atop of him. "Lad!" cried the mistress aghast. "Lad!" Through the avenging rage that misted his brain, the great dog heard. With a choking sound that was almost a sob, he relinquished his hold and turned slowly from his prey. The master and Glure instinctively took a step toward the approaching dog and the writhingly prostrate man. Then, still more instinctively, and without even coming to a standstill before going into reverse, they both sprang back. They would have sprang back further had not the roped walls of the show ring checked them, for Tenebris had taken a sudden and active part in the scene. The gigantic Holstein during his career in Europe had trebly won his title to champion, and during the 3 years before his exportation to America he had gored to death no fewer than 3 overconfident stable attendants. The bull's homicidal temper, no less than the dazzling price offered by Glure, had caused his owner to sell him to the transatlantic bidder. A bull's nose is the tenderest spot of his anatomy. Next to his eyes he guards its safety most zealously. Thus, with a stout leading bar between him and his conductor, Tenebris was harmless enough. But the conductor just now had let go of that bar, as Lad's weight had smitten him. Freed, Tenebris had stood for an instant in perplexity. Fiercely he flung his gnarled head to one side to see the cause of the commotion. The gesture swung the heavy leading bar, digging the nose ring cruelly into his sensitive nostrils. The pain maddened Tenebris. A final plunging twist of the head, and the bar's weight tore the nose ring free from the nostrils. Tenebris bellowed thunderously at the climax of pain. Then he realized he had shaken off the only thing that gave humans a control over him. A second bellow, a furious pawing of the earth, and the bull lowered his head. His evil eyes glared about him in search of something to kill. It was the sight of this motion which sent the Master and Glure recoiling against the show-ring ropes. In almost the same move the Master caught up his wife and swung her over the top rope into the ring. He followed her into that refuge's fragile safety with a speed that held no dignity whatever. Glure, seeing the action, wasted no time in wriggling through the ropes after him. Tenebris did not follow them. One thing, and only one, his red eyes saw. On the ground, not 6 feet away, rolled and moaned a man. The man was down. He was helpless. Tenebris charged. A bull plunging at a nearby object shuts both eyes. A cow does not. Which may or may not explain the Spanish theory that bullfights are safer than cow fights. To this eye-closing trait many a hard-pressed matador has owed his life. Tenebris, both eyes screwed shut, hurled his 2,000-pound bulk at the prostrate groom. Head down, nose in, short horns on the level with the earth, and barely clearing it, he made his rush. But at the very first step he became aware that something was amiss with his pleasantly anticipated charge. It did not follow specifications or precedent. All because a heavy something had flung its weight against the side of his lowered head, and a new and unbearable pain was torturing his blood-filled nostrils. Tenebris swerved. He veered to one side, throwing up his head to clear it of this unseen torment. As a result, the half-lifted horns grazed the fallen man. The pointed hooves missed him altogether. At the same moment the weight was gone from against the bull's head, and the throbbing stab from his nostrils. Pausing uncertainly, Tenebris opened his eyes and glared about him. A yard or two away a shaggy dog was rising from the tumble caused by the jerky up-tossing of the bull's head. Now, were this a fiction yarn, it would be interesting to devise reasons why Lad should have flown to the rescue of a human whom he loathed, and arrayed himself against the fellow beast toward which he felt no hatred at all. To dogs all men are gods, and perhaps Lad felt the urge of saving even a detested god from the onslaught of a beast. Or perhaps not. One can only go by the facts. And the facts were that the collie had checked himself in the reluctant journey toward the mistress and had gone to his foe's defense. With a flash of speed astonishing in so large and sedate a dog, he had flown at the bull in time, in the barest time, to grip the torn nostrils and turn the whirlwind charge. And now Tenebris shifted his baleful glare from the advancing dog to the howling man. The dog could wait. The bull's immediate pleasure and purpose were to kill the man. He lowered his head again, but before he could launch his enormous bulk into full motion, before he could shut his eyes, the dog was between him and his quarry. In one spring Lad was at the bull's nose, and again his white eye teeth slashed the ragged nostrils. Tenebris halted his own incipient rush and strove to pin the collie to the ground. It would have been as easy to pin a whizzing hornet. Tenebris thrust at the clinging dog, once more seeking to smash Lad against the sod with his battering-ram forehead and his short horns. But Lad was not there. Instead, he was to the left, his body clean out of danger, his teeth in the bull's left ear. A lunge of the tortured head sent Lad rolling over and over, but by the time he stopped rolling he was on his feet again. not only on his feet, but back to the assault, back before his unwieldy foe could gauge the distance for another rush at the man, and a keen nip in the bleeding nostrils balked still one more charge. The bull, snorting with rage, suddenly changed his plan of campaign. Apparently his first ideas had been wrong. It was the man who could wait, and the dog that must be gotten out of the way. Tenebris wheeled and made an express train rush at Lad. The collie turned and fled. He did not flee with tail down, as befits a beaten dog. Brush waving aloft, he gamboled along at top speed, just a stride or two ahead of the pursuing bull. He even looked back encouragingly over his shoulder as he went. Lad was having a beautiful time. Seldom had he been so riotously happy. All the pent-up mischief in his soul was having a glorious airing. The bull's blind charge was short, as a bull's charge always is. When Tenebris opened his eyes, he saw the dog, not 10 feet in front of him, scampering for dear life toward the river, and again Tenebris charged. 3 such charges, one after another, brought pursuer and pursued to within 100 feet of the water. Tenebris was not used to running. He was getting winded. He came to a wavering standstill, snorting loudly and pawing up great lumps of sod. But he had not stood thus longer than a second before Lad was at him. Burnished shaggy coat abristle, tail delightedly wagging, the dog bounded forward. He set up an ear-splitting fanfare of barking. Round and round the bull he whirled, never letting up on that deafening volley of barks, nipping now at ears, now at nose, now at heels, dodging in and out under the giant's clumsy body, easily avoiding the bewilderingly awkward kicks and lunges of his enemy. Then, 4 feet crouching and muzzle close to the ground, like a playful puppy, he waved his plumed tail violently, and, in a new succession of barks, wooed his adversary to the attack. It was a pretty sight, and it set Tenebris into active motion at once. The bull doubtless thought he himself was doing the driving, by means of his panting rushes, and by his lurches to one side or another to keep away from the dog's sharp bites. But he was not. It was Lad who chose the direction in which they went, and he chose it deliberately. Presently the two were but 15 feet away from the river, at a point where the bank shelved, cliff-like, for 2 or 3 yards down to a wide pool. Feinting for the nose, Lad induced Tenebris to lower his tired head. Then he sprang lightly over the threatening horns and landed a scramble with all 4 feet on the bull's broad shoulders. Scurrying along the heaving back, the dog nipped Tenebris on the hip and dropped to earth again. The insult, the fresh pain, the astonishment combined to make Tenebris forget his weariness. Beside himself with maniac wrath, he shut both eyes and launched himself forward. Lad slipped, eel-like, to one side. Carried by his own blind momentum, Tenebris shot over the bank edge. Too late the bull looked. Half sliding, half scrambling, he crashed down the steep sides of the bank and into the river. Lad, tongue out, jogged over to the top of the bank, where, with head to one side and ears cocked, he gazed interestedly down into the wildly churned pool. Tenebris had gotten to his feet after the ducking, and he was floundering, pastern-deep in stickily soft mud, so tightly bogged down that it later took the efforts of 6 farm hands to extricate him. The bull continued to flounder and to bellow. A stream of people were running down the meadow toward the river. Lad hated crowds. He made a loping detour of the nearest runners, and sought to regain the spot where last he had seen the mistress and master. Also, if his luck held good, he might still have another bout with the man he had once treed, which would be an ideal climax to a perfect day. He found all the objects of his quest together. The groom, hysterical, was swaying on his feet, supported by Glure. At sight of the advancing collie, the bitten man cried aloud in fear, and clutched his employer for protection. "Take him away, sir," he babbled in mortal terror. "He'll kill me. He hates me. The ugly, hairy devil! He hates me! He tried to kill me once before. He—" mused the master. "So he tried to kill you once before, eh? Aren't you mistaken?" "No, I ain't," wept the man. "I known him in a million. That's why he went for me again to-day. He remembered me. I seen he did. That's no dog. It's a devil." "Mr. Glure," asked the master, a light dawning, "when this chap applied to you for work, did he wear grayish tweed trousers, and were they in bad shape?" "His trousers were in rags," said Glure. "I remember that. He said a savage dog had jumped into the road from a farmhouse somewhere and gone for him. Why?" "Those trousers," answered the master, "weren't entire strangers to you. You'd seen the missing parts of them, on a tree and on the ground near it, at the place. Your treasure is the harness thief Lad treed the day you came to see me. So—" "Nonsense!" fumed Glure. "Why, how absurd! I ain't stolen nothin'," blubbered the man. "I was comin' cross lots to a stable to ask for work, and the brute went for me. I had to run up a tree and—" "And it didn't occur to you to shout for help?" sweetly urged the master. "I was within call. So was Mr. Glure. So was at least one of my men. An honest seeker for work needn't have been afraid to hello. A thief would have been afraid to. In fact, a thief was." "Get out of here, you!" roared Glure, convinced at last. "You measly sneak thief! Get out, or I'll have you jailed. You're an impostor, a panhandler, a—" The thief waited to hear no more. With an apprehensive glance to see that Lad was firmly held, he bolted for the road. "Thanks for telling me," said Glure. "He might have stolen everything at Glure Towers if I hadn't found out." "Yes. He might even have stolen more than the cost of our non-utilitarian Lad's keep," unkindly suggested the master. "For that matter, if it hadn't been for a non-utilitarian dog, that mad bull's horns, instead of his nostrils, would be red by this time. At least one man would have been killed, perhaps more. So, after all—" He stopped. The mistress was tugging surreptitiously at his sleeve. The master, in obedience to his wife's signal, stepped aside to light a cigar. "I wouldn't say any more, dear, if I were you," the mistress was whispering. "You see, if it hadn't been for Lad, the bull would never have broken loose in the first place. By another half hour that fact may dawn on Mr. Glure, if you keep rubbing it in. Let's go over to the grandstand. Come, Lad." End of Chapter 9. Recording by Greg Giordano. Chapter 10 of Lad, a Dog by Albert Payson Terhune. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Greg Giordano. Chapter 10 The Killer. One of the jolliest moments in Lad's daily cross-country tramp with the mistress and the master was his dash up Mount Pisgah. This mount was little more than a foothill. It was treeless and covered with short grass and mullein, a slope where no crop but buckwheat could be expected to thrive. It rose out of the adjoining mountain forests in a long and sweeping ascent. Here, with no trees or undergrowth to impede him, Lad, from puppyhood, had ordained a race course of his own. As he neared the hill, he would always dash forward at top speed, flying up the rise like a tawny whirlwind at unabated pace, until he stopped, panting and gloriously excited, on the summit, to await his slower moving human escorts. One morning in early summer, Lad as usual bounded ahead of the mistress and the master, as they drew near to his treeless mount. and, as ever, he rushed gleefully forward for his daily breather, up the long slope. But, before he had gone 50 yards, he came to a scurrying halt, and stood at gaze. His back was bristling, and his lips curled back from his white teeth in sudden annoyance. His keen nostrils, even before his eyes told him something was amiss with his cherished race track. The eddying shift of the breeze, from west to north, had brought to his nose the odor which had checked his onrush, an odor that wakened all sorts of vaguely formless memories far back in Lad's brain, and which he did not at all care for. Scent is 10 times stronger to a dog than is sight. The best dog is near-sighted, and the worst dog has a magic sense of smell. Wherefore a dog almost always uses his nose first and his eyes last, which Lad now proceeded to do. Above him was the pale green hillside, up which he loved to gallop, but its surface was no longer smoothly unencumbered. Instead, it was dotted and starred, singly or in groups, with fluffy, grayish-white creatures. Lad was almost abreast of the lowest group of sheep when he paused. Several of the feeding animals lifted their heads, snortingly, from the short herbage, at sight of him, and fled up the hill. The rest of the flock joined them in the silly stampede. The dog made no move to follow. Instead, his forehead creased and his eyes troubled. He stared after the gray-white surge that swept upward toward the summit of his favorite coursing ground. The mistress and the master, too, at sight of the woolly avalanche, stopped and stared. From over the brow of Mount Pisgah appeared the non-picturesque figure of a man in blue denim overalls, one Titus Romaine, owner of the sparse-grassed hill. Drawn by the noisy multiple patter of his flock's hoofs, he emerged from under a hilltop boulder's shade to learn the cause of their flight. Now in all his life Lad had seen sheep just once before. That one exception had been when Hamilcar Q. Glure, the Wall Street farmer, had corralled a little herd of his prize merinos overnight at the place, on the way to the Patterson Livestock Show. On that occasion the sheep had broken from the corral, and Lad, acting on ancestral instinct, had rounded them up without injuring or scaring one of them. The memory was not pleasing to Lad, and he wanted nothing more to do with such stupid creatures. Indeed, as he looked now upon the sheep that were obstructing his run, he felt a distinct aversion to them. Whining a little, he trotted back to where stood the mistress and the master, and as they waited, Titus Romaine bore wrathfully down upon them. "I've been expecting something like that," announced the landowner, "ever since I turned these critters out here this mornin'. I ain't surprised a bit. "What is it you've been expecting, Romaine?" asked the master. "And how long have you been a sheep-raiser? A sheep, here in the North Jersey hinterland, is as rare as—" "I been expecting some savage dog would be runnin' 'em," retorted the farmer, "just like I've read they do. And now I've caught him at it." "Caught whom? At what?" queried the perplexed mistress, failing to note the man's baleful glower at the contemptuous lad. "That big, ugly brute of yourn, of course," declared Romaine. "I caught him, red-handed, runnin' my sheep. He—" "Lad did nothing of the kind," denied the mistress. "The instant he caught sight of them he stopped running. Lad wouldn't hurt anything that is weak and helpless. Your sheep saw him, and they ran away. He didn't follow them an inch." "I seen what I seen," cryptically answered the man, "and I give you fair warnin'. If any of my sheep is killed, I'll know right where to come to look for the killer." "If you mean Lad—" began the master hotly, but the mistress intervened. "I am glad you have decided to raise sheep, Mr. Romaine," she said. "Everyone ought to, who can. I read, only the other day, that America is using up more sheep than it can breed. and that the price of fodder and the scarcity of pasture were doing terrible things to the mutton and wool supply. I hope you'll have all sorts of good luck, and you are wise to watch your sheep so closely. But don't be afraid of Lad harming any of them. He wouldn't for worlds, I know, because I know Lad. Come along, Laddie," she finished as she turned to go away. But Titus Romaine stopped her. "I've put a sight of money into this flock of sheep," he declared, "more'n I could really afford. And I've been readin' up on sheep, too. I've been readin' that the worst enemy to sheep is predatory dogs. And if that big dog of yourn ain't predatory, then I never seen one that was. So I'm warnin' you fair." "If your sheep come to any harm, Mr. Romaine," returned the mistress, again forestalling an untactful outbreak from her husband, "I'll guarantee Lad will have nothing to do with it." "And I'll guarantee to have him shot, and have you folks up in court if he does," chivalrously retorted Mr. Titus Romaine. With which exchange of good fellowship the two groups parted, Romaine returning to his scattered sheep, while the mistress, Lad at her heels, lured the master away from the field of encounter. The master was fuming. "Here's where's good old Mr. Trouble drops in on us for a nice long visit," he grumbled, as they moved homeward. "I can see how it is going to turn out, because a few stray curs have chased or killed sheep now and then. Every decent dog is under suspicion as a sheep killer. If one of Romaine's wethers gets a scratch on its leg from a bramble, Lad will be blamed. If one of the mongrels from over in the village should chase his sheep, Lad will be accused, and we'll be in the first neighborhood squabble of our lives." The master spoke with a pessimism his wife did not share, and which he himself did not really believe. The folk at the place had always lived in good fellowship and peace with their few rural neighbors, as well as with the several hundred inhabitants of the mile-distant village across the lake. And, though livestock is the foundation of 90 rustic feuds out of 91, the dogs of the place had never involved their owners in any such row. Yet, barely 3 days later, Titus Romaine bore down upon the place, before breakfast, breathing threatenings and complaining of slaughter. He was waiting on the veranda in blasphemous converse with the place's foreman, when the master came out. At Titus's heels stood his hired man, a huge and sullen person named Schwartz, who possessed a scarce conquered accent that fitted the name. "Well," orated Romaine, in glum greeting, as he sighted the master, "well, I guessed right. He done it after all. He done it. We all but caught him red-handed. Got away with 4 of my best sheep. 4 of 'em. The cur!" "What are you talking about?" demanded the master, as the mistress, drawn by the visitor's plaintive tones, joined the veranda group. "About that ugly big dog of yourn," answered Romaine. "I knew what he'd do, if he got the chance. I knew it. When I saw him running my poor sheep last week, I warned you then, the 2 of you, and now he's done it." "Done what?" insisted the master, impatient of the man's noise and fury. "What dog?" asked the mistress at the same time. "Are you talking about Lad? If you are—" "I'm talking about your big brown collie cur," snorted Titus. "He's gone and killed 4 of my best sheep. Did it in the night, and early this mornin'. My man here caught him at the last of 'em, and drove him off, just as he was finishin' the poor critter. He got away with the rest of 'em." "Nonsense!" denied the master. "You're talking rot. Lad wouldn't touch a sheep, and—" "That's what all folks say when their dogs or their children is charged with doin' wrong," scoffed Romaine. "But this time it won't do no good to—" "You say this happened last night?" interposed the mistress. "Yes, it did. Last night and early in the mornin', too. Schwartz here—" "But Lad sleeps in the house every night," objected the mistress. "He sleeps under the piano, in the music room. He has slept there every night since he was a puppy. The maid who dusts the downstairs rooms before breakfast lets him out, when she begins work. So he—" "Bolster it up any way you like," broke in Romayne. "He was out last night, all right, and early this morning, too." "How early?" questioned the master.
5 o'clock," volunteered Schwartz, speaking up from behind his employer. "I know, because that's the time I get up. I went out, first thing, to open the barnyard gate and drive the sheep to the pasture. First thing I saw was that big dog growling over a sheep he'd just killed. He saw me, and he wiggled out through the barnyard bars. Some way he had got in. Then I counted the sheep. One was dead, the one he had just killed, and 3 were gone. We've been looking for their bodies ever since, and we can't find 'em."
"I suppose Lad swallowed them?" ironically put in the place's foreman. "That makes about as much sense as the rest of the yarn. The old dog would no sooner—" "Do you really mean to say you saw Lad, saw and recognized him in Mr. Titus's barnyard, growling over a sheep he had just killed?" demanded the mistress.
"I sure do," affirmed Schwartz. "And
"And he's ready to go on the stand and take oath to it," supplemented Titus, "unless you'll pay me the damages out of court. Them sheep cost me exactly $12.10 a head, in the Patson market, 1 week ago, and sheep on the hoof has gone up a full 40 cents more since then. You owe me for them 4 sheep exactly."
"I owe you not 1 red cent," denied the master. "I hate law worse than I hate measles, but I'll fight that idiotic claim all the way up to the appellate division before I'll—"
The mistress lifted a little silver whistle that hung at her belt and blew it. An instant later Lad came galloping gaily up the lawn from the lake, adrip with water from his morning swim. Straight at the mistress's summons he came and stood, expectant, in front of her, oblivious of others. The great dog's mahogany and snow coat shone wetly in the sunshine. Every line of his splendid body was tense. His eyes looked up into the face of the loved mistress in eager anticipation, for a whistle call usually involved some matter of more than common interest.
"That's the dog!"
cried Schwartz, his thick voice betraying a shade more of its half-lost German accent in the excitement of the minute.
"That's the one. He has washed off the blood. But that is the one. I could know him anywhere at all, and I know him already. And Mr. Romayne told me to be looking out for him, about the sheep, too, so I—"
The master had bent over Lad, examining the dog's mouth. "Not a trace of blood or of wool," he announced. "And look how he faces us, if he had anything to be ashamed of."
"I got a witness to prove he killed my sheep," cut in Romayne.
"Since you won't be honest enough to square the case out of court, then the law'll take a tuck in your wallet for you. The law will look after a poor man's interest. I don't wonder there's folks who want all dogs done 'way with. Pesky curs! Here, the papers say we are short on sheep, and they beg us to raise 'em, because mutton is worth double what it used to be in open market. Then, when I buy sheep, on that say-so, your dog gets 4 of 'em the very first week. Think what them 4 sheep would 'a' meant to—"
"I'm sorry you lost them," the master interrupted.
"Mighty sorry. And I'm still sorrier if there is a sheep-killing dog at large anywhere in this region. But Lad never—"
"I tell ye he did!" stormed Titus. "I got proof of it. Proof good enough for any court. And the court is going to see me righted. It's going to do more. It's going to make you shoot that killer there, too. I know the law. I looked it up, and the law says if a sheep-killing dog—"
"Lad is not a sheep-killing dog," flashed the mistress.
"That's what he is," snarled Romayne. "And by law he'll be shot as such. He—"
"Take your case to law, then," retorted the master, whose last shred of patience went by the board at the threat. "And take it and yourself off my place. Lad doesn't run sheep. But, at the word from me, he'll ask nothing better than to run you and your German every step of the way to your own woodshed. Clear out!" He and the mistress watched the two irately mumbling intruders plod out of sight up the drive. Lad, at the master's side, viewed the accuser's departure with sharp interest. Schooled in reading the human voice, he had listened alertly to the master's speech of dismissal, and, as the dog listened, his teeth had come slowly into view from beneath a menacingly up-curled lip. His eyes, half shut, had been fixed on Titus with an expression that was not pretty. "Oh, dear!" sighed the mistress miserably, as she and her husband turned indoors and made their way toward the breakfast-room. "You were right about good old Mr. Trouble dropping in on us. Isn't it horrible? But it makes my blood boil to think of Laddie being accused of such a thing. It is crazily absurd, of course, but—" "Absurd!" the master caught her up. "It's the most absurd thing I ever heard of. If it was about any other dog than Lad, it would be good for a laugh. I mean Romayne's charge of the dog's doing away with no less than 4 sheep, and not leaving a trace of more than one of them. That alone would get his case laughed out of court. I remember once in Scotland I was stopping with some people whose shepherd complained that 3 of the sheep had fallen victim to a killer. We all went up to the moor pasture to look at them. They weren't a pretty sight, but they were all there. A dog doesn't devour a sheep he kills. He doesn't even lug it away. Instead, he just—" "Perhaps you'd rather describe it after breakfast," suggested the mistress hurriedly. "This wretched business has taken away all of my appetite that I can comfortably spare." At about mid-morning of the next day the master was summoned to the telephone. "This is Maclay," said the voice at the far end. "Why, hello, Mac," responded the master, mildly wondering why his old fishing crony, the village's local peace justice, should be calling him up at such an hour. "If you're going to tell me this is a good day for smallmouth bass to bite, I'm going to tell you it isn't. It isn't because I'm up to my neck in work. Besides, it's too late for the morning fishing, and too early for the bass to get up their afternoon appetites, so don't try to tempt me into—" "Hold on," broke in Maclay. "I'm not calling you up for that. I'm calling you up on business. Rotten, unpleasant business, too." "What's wrong?" asked the master. "I'm hoping Titus Romayne is," said the justice. "He's just been here, with his North Prussian hired man as witness, to make a complaint about your dog Lad. Yes, and to get a court order to have the old fellow shot, too." "What?" spluttered the master. "He hasn't actually—" "That's just what he's done," said Maclay. "He claims Lad killed 4 of his new sheep night before last, and 4 more of them this morning or last night. Schwartz swears he caught Lad at the last of the killed sheep both times. It's hard luck, old man, and I feel as bad about it as if it were my own dog. You know how strong I am for Lad. He's the greatest collie I've ever known. But the law is clear in such—" "You speak as if you thought Lad was guilty," flamed the master. "You ought to know better than that. He—" "Schwartz tells a straight story," answered Maclay sadly, "and he tells it under oath. He swears he recognized Lad first time. He says he volunteered to watch in the barnyard last night. He had had a hard day's work, and he fell asleep while he was on watch. He says he woke up in gray dawn to find the whole flock in a turmoil, and Lad pinning one of the sheep to the ground. He had already killed 3. Schwartz drove him away. 3 of the sheep were missing. One Lad had just downed was dying. Romayne swears he saw Lad running his sheep last week. It—" "What did you do about the case?" asked the dazed master. "I told them to be at the court-room at 3 this afternoon with the bodies of the 2 dead sheep that aren't missing, and I'd notify you to be there, too." "Oh, I'll be there," snapped the master. "Don't worry. And it was decent of you to make them wait. The whole thing is ridiculous. It—" "Of course," went on Maclay, "either side can easily appeal from any decision I make. That is as regards damages. But, by the township's new sheep laws,
I'm sorry to say there isn't any appeal from the local justice's decree that a sheep-killing dog must be shot at once. The law leaves me no option if I consider a dog guilty of sheep-killing. I have to order such a dog put to death at once. That's what's making me so blue. I'd rather lose a year's pay than have to order old Lad killed." "You won't have to," declared the master stoutly, albeit he was beginning to feel a nasty sinking in the vicinity of his stomach. "We'll manage to prove him innocent. I'll stake anything you like on that." "Talk the case over with Dick Colfax or any other good lawyer before 3 o'clock," suggested Maclay. "There may be a legal loophole out of the muddle. I hope to the Lord there is." "We're not going to crawl out through any loopholes, Lad and I," returned the master. "We're going to come through clean. See if we don't." Leaving the telephone, he went in search of the mistress, and more disheartened told her the story. "The worst of it is," he finished, "Romayne and Schwartz seem to have made Maclay believe their full yarn." "That is because they believe it themselves," said the mistress, "and because, just as soon as even the most sensible man is made a judge, he seems to lose all his common sense and intuition, and become nothing but a walking statute book. But you think for a moment, do you, that they can persuade Judge Maclay to have Lad shot?" She spoke with a little quiver in her sweet voice that roused all the master's fighting spirit. "This place is going to be in a state of siege against the entire law and militia of New Jersey," he announced, "before one bullet goes into Lad. You can put your mind to rest on that. But that isn't enough. I want to clear him. In these days of conservation and scarcity, it is a grave offense to destroy any meat animal, and the loss of 8 sheep in 2 days, in a district where there has been such an effort made to revive sheep raising—" "Didn't you say they claim the second lot of sheep were killed in the night, and at dawn, just as they said the first were?" interposed the mistress. "Why, yes, but—" "Then," said the mistress much more comfortably, "we can prove Lad's alibi, just as I said yesterday we could. Marie always lets him out in the morning when he comes downstairs to dust these lower rooms. She's never down before 6 o'clock, and the sun nowadays rises long before that. Schwartz says he saw Lad both times in the early dawn. We can prove by Marie that Lad was safe here in the house till long after sunrise." Her worried frown gave way to a smile of positive inspiration. The master's own darkling face cleared. "Good!" he approved. "I think that cinches it. Marie's been with us for years. Her word is certainly as good as a Boche farmhand's. Even Maclay's judicial temperament will have to admit that. Send her in here, won't you?" When the maid appeared at the door of the study a minute later, the master opened the examination with the solemn air of a legal veteran. "You are the first person down here in the mornings, aren't you, Marie?" he began. "Why, yes, sir," replied the wondering maid. "Yes, always, except when you get up early to go fishing, or when—" "What time do you get down here in the mornings?" pursued the master. "Along about 6 o'clock, sir, mostly," said the maid, bridling a bit as if scenting a criticism of her work hours. "Not earlier than 6?" asked the master. "No, sir," said Marie uncomfortably. "Of course, if that's not early enough, I suppose I could—" "Oh, it's quite early enough," vouchsafed the master. "There is no complaint about your hours. You always let Lad out as soon as you come into the music-room?" "Yes, sir," she answered. "As soon as I get downstairs. Those were the orders, you remember." The master breathed a silent sigh of relief. The maid did not get downstairs until 6. The dog, then, could not get out of the house until that hour. If Schwartz had seen any dog in the Romayne barnyard at daybreak, it assuredly was not Lad. Yet, racking his brain, the master could not recall any other dog in the vicinity that bore even the faintest semblance to his giant collie, and he fell to recalling, from his happy memories of Bob, son of Battle, that killers often travel many miles from home to sate
their mania for sheep slaying. In any event, it was no concern of his if some distant collie, drawn to the slaughter by the queer sixth collie sense, was killing Romayne's new flock of sheep. Lad was cleared. The maid's very evidently true testimony settled that point. "Yes, sir," rambled on Marie, beginning to take a faint interest in the examination now that it turned upon Lad, whom she loved. "Yes, sir. Laddie always comes out from under his piano the minute he hears my step in the hall outside, and he always comes right up to me and wags that big plume of a tail of his, and falls into step alongside of me, and walks over to the front door, right beside me all the way. He knows as much as many a human, that dog does, sir." Encouraged by the master's approving nod, the maid ventured to enlarge still further upon the theme. "It always seems as if he was welcoming me downstairs like," she resumed, "and glad to see me. I've really missed him quite bad these past few mornings." The approving look on the master's face gave way to a glare of utter blankness. "This past few mornings?" he repeated blitheringly. "What do you mean?" "Why," she returned, flustered afresh by the quick change in her interlocutor's manner, "ever since those French windows are left open for the night, same as they always are when the hot weather starts in, you know, sir. Since then, Laddie don't wait for me to let him out. When he wakes up, he just goes out himself. He used to do that last year, too, sir. He—" "Thanks," muttered the master, dizzily. "That's all. Thanks." Left alone, he sat slumped low in his chair, trying to think. He was as calmly convinced as ever of his dog's innocence, but he had staked everything on Marie's court testimony, and now that testimony was rendered worse than worthless. Crankily, he cursed his own fresh-air mania, which had decreed that the long windows on the ground floor be left open on summer nights. With Lad on duty, the house was as safe from successful burglary in spite of these open windows as if guarded by a squad of special policemen, and the night air, sweeping through, kept it pleasantly cool against the next day's heat. For this same coolness a heavy price was now due. Presently the days of disappointment passed, leaving the master pulsing with a wholesome fighting anger. Rapidly he revised his defense, and, with the mistress's far clever aid, made ready for the afternoon's ordeal. He scouted Maclay's suggestion of hiring counsel, and vowed to handle the defense himself. Carefully he and his wife went over their proposed line of action. Peace Justice Maclay's court was held daily in a rambling room on an upper floor of the village's Odd Fellows' Hall. The proceedings there were generally marked by shrewd sanity rather than by any effort at formalism. Maclay himself sat at a battered little desk at the room's far end, his clerk using a corner of the same desk for the scribbling of his sketchy notes. In front of the desk was a rather long deal table with kitchen chairs round it. Here plaintiffs and defendants and prisoners and witnesses and lawyers were wont to sit, with no order of precedent or of other formality. Several other chairs were ranged irregularly along the wall to accommodate any overflow of the table's occupants. Promptly at 3 o'clock that afternoon, the mistress and the master entered the courtroom. Close at the mistress's side, though held by no leash, paced Lad. Maclay and Romayne and Schwartz were already on hand. So were the clerk and the constable and one or two idle spectators. At a corner of the room, wrapped in burlap, were huddled the bodies of the 2 slain sheep. Lad caught the scent of the victims the instant he set foot in the room, and he sniffed vibrantly once or twice. Titus Romayne, his eyes fixed scowlingly on the dog, noted this, and he nudged Schwartz in the ribs to call the German's attention to it. Lad turned aside in fastidious disgust from the bumpy burlap bundle. Seeing the judge and recognizing him as an old acquaintance, the collie wagged his plumed tail in gravely friendly greetings and stepped forward for a pat on the head. "Lad!" called the mistress softly. At the word the dog paused midway to the embarrassed Maclay's desk, and obediently turned back. The constable was drawing up a chair at the deal table for the mistress. Lad curled down beside her.
resting one snowy little forepaw protectingly on her slippered foot, and the hearing began. Romayne repeated his account of the collie's alleged depredations, starting with Lad's first view of the sheep. Schwartz methodically retold his own story of twice witnessing the killing of sheep by the dog. The master did not interrupt either narrative, though. On later questioning he forced the sulkily truthful Romayne to admit he had not actually seen Lad chase the sheep flock that morning on Mount Pisgah, but had merely seen the sheep running, and the dog standing at the hill foot looking upward at their scattering flight. Both the mistress and the master swore that the dog on that occasion had made no move to pursue or otherwise harass the sheep. Thus did Lad win one point in the case. But, in view of the after-crimes wherewith he was charged, the point was of decidedly trivial value. Even if he had not attacked the flock on his first view of them, he was accused of killing no less than 8 of their number on 2 later encounters. And Schwartz was an eye-witness to this. Schwartz, whose testimony was as clear and as simple as daylight. With a glance of apology at the mistress, Judge Maclay ordered the sheep carcasses taken from the burlap cerements and laid on the table for court inspection. While he and Schwartz arranged the grisly exhibits for the judge's view, Titus Romayne expatiated loudly on the value of the murdered sheep and on the brutally useless wastage in their slaying. The master said nothing, but he bent over each of his sheep, carefully studying the throat wounds. At last he straightened himself up from his task, and broke in on Romayne's Antony-like funeral oration by saying quietly, "Your Honor, these sheep's throats were not cut by a dog, neither by Lad nor by any killer. Look for yourself. I've seen dog-killed sheep. These wounds were not at all like those." "Not killed by a dog, hey?" loudly scoffed Romayne. "I s'pose they was chewed by lightnin' then, or maybe they was bit by a skeeter, huh?" "They were not bitten at all," countered the master. "Still less were they chewed. Look, those gashes are ragged enough, but they are as straight as if they were made by a machine. If ever you have seen a dog worry a piece of meat—" "Rubbish!" grunted Titus. "You talk like a fool. The sheep's throats is torn. Schwartz senior cur tear 'em. That's all there is to it. Whether he tore 'em straight or whether he tore 'em crooked don't count in law. He tore 'em, and I got a reliable witness to prove it." "Your Honor," said the master suddenly, "may I interrogate the witness?" Maclay nodded. The master turned to Schwartz, who faced him in stolid composure. "Schwartz," began the master, "you say it was light enough for you to recognize the sheep-killing dog both mornings in Romayne's barnyard. How near to him did you get?" Schwartz pondered for a second, then made careful answer. "First time I ran into the barnyard from the house side, and your dog cut and run out of it from the far side when he saw me making for him. That time I don't think I got within 30 feet of him, but I was near enough to see him plain, and I'd seen him often enough before on the road or in your car, so I knew him all right. The next time, this morning, Judge, I was within 5 feet of him, or even nearer, for I was near enough to hit him with the stick I just picked up, and to land a kick on his ribs as he started away. I saw him then as plain as I see you, and nearer than I am to you, and the light was most good enough to read by, too." "Yes," queried the master. "If I remember rightly, you told Judge Maclay that you were on watch last night in the cowshed, just alongside the barnyard, where the sheep were, and you fell asleep, and woke just in time to see a dog—" "To see your dog," corrected Schwartz. "To see a dog growling over a squirming and bleeding sheep he had pulled down. How far away from you was he when you awoke?" "Just outside the cowshed door, not 6 feet from me. I ups with the stick I had with me, and ran out at him, and—" "Were he and the sheep making much noise?" "Between 'em they was making enough racket to wake a dead man," replied Schwartz. "What with your dog's snarling and growling, and the poor sheep's blats, and all the other sheep." "Yet you say he had killed 3 sheep while you slept there, had killed them, and carried or dragged their bodies away, and come back again, and presumably started a noisy panic in the flock every time, and none of that racket waked you until the 4th sheep was killed." "I was dog-tired," declared Schwartz. "I'd been at work in our south mowing for 10 hours the day before, and up since 5. Mr. Romayne can tell you I'm a hard man to wake at best. I sleep like the dead." "That's right," assented Titus. "Time and again I have to bang at his door and holler myself hoarse, before I can get him to open his eyes. My wife says he's the sleepinest sleeper—" "You ran out of the shed with your stick," resumed the master, "and struck the dog before he could get away, and as he turned to run you kicked him." "Yes, sir, that's what I did." "How hard did you hit him?" "A pretty good lick," answered Schwartz, with reminiscent satisfaction. "Then I—" "And when you hit him he slunk away like a whipped cur? He made no move to resent it? I mean, he did not try to attack you?" "Not him," asserted Schwartz. "I guess he was glad enough to get out of reach. He slunk away so fast, I hardly had a chance to land fair on him when I kicked." "Here is my riding crop," said the master. "Take it, please, and strike Lad with it, just as you struck him, or the sheep-killing dog, with your stick, just as hard. Lad has never been struck except once, unjustly, by me, years ago. He has never needed it. But if he would slink away like a whipped mongrel when a stranger hits him, the sooner he is beaten to death the better. Hit him exactly as you hit him this morning." Judge Maclay half opened his lips to protest. He knew the love of the people of the place for Lad, and he wondered at this invitation to a farm hand to thrash the dog publicly. He glanced at the mistress. Her face was calm, even a little amused. Evidently the master's request did not horrify or surprise her. Schwartz's stubby fingers gripped the crop the master forced into his hand. With true Teutonic relish for pain inflicting, he swung the weapon aloft and took a step toward the lazily recumbent collie, striking with all his strength. Then, with much increased speed, Schwartz took 3 steps backward. For, at the menace, Lad had leaped to his feet with the speed of a fighting wolf, eluding the descending crop as it swished past him and launching himself straight for the wielder's throat. He did not growl, he did not pause. He merely sprang for his assailant with a deadly ferocity that brought a cry from Maclay. The master caught the huge dog midway in his throatward flight. "Down, Lad," he ordered gently. The collie, obedient to the word, stretched himself on the floor at the mistress's feet, but he kept a watchful and right unloving eye on the man who had struck at him. "It's a bit odd, isn't it," suggested the master, "that he went for you like that, just now, when, this morning, he slunk away from your blow in cringing fear?" "Why wouldn't he?" growled Schwartz, his stolid nerves shaken up by the unexpected onslaught. "His folks are here to back him up and everything. Why wouldn't he go for me? He was slinky enough when I whaled him this morning." Mused the master. "You hit a strong blow, Schwartz, I'll say that for you. You missed Lad with my crop, but you split the crop, and you scored a visible mark on the wooden floor with it. Did you hit as hard as that when you struck the sheep-killer this morning?" "A sight harder," responded Schwartz. "My mad was up. "A dog's skin is softer than a pine floor," said the master. "Your honor, such a blow would have raised a wheal on Lad's flesh an inch high. Would your honor mind passing in your hand over his body and trying to locate such a wheal?" "This is all outside the point," raged the annoyed Titus Romayne. "You're a dodging the issue. I tell ye,
"If your honor please," insisted the master. The judge left his desk and whistled Lad across to him. The dog looked at his master doubtfully. The master nodded. The collie arose and walked in leisurely fashion over to the waiting judge. Maclay ran an exploring hand through the magnificent tawny coat, from head to haunch, then along the dog's furry sides. Lad hated to be handled by anyone but the mistress or the master, but at a soft word from the mistress he stood stock still and submitted to the inspection. "I find no wheal or any other mark on him," presently reported the judge. The mistress smiled happily. The whole investigation up to this point and further was along eccentric lines she herself had thought out and had suggested to her husband, lines suggested by her knowledge of Lad. "Schwartz," went on the master, interrupting another fuming outbreak from Romayne, "I'm afraid you didn't quite hit as hard as you thought you did, this morning, or else some other dog is carrying around a big welt on his flesh to-day. Now for the kick you say you gave the collie, I won't copy that on your bloodthirsty dog," vociferated Schwartz. "Not even if the judge jails me for contempt, I won't. He'd likely kill me." "And yet he ran from you this morning," the master reminded him. "Well, I won't insist on your kicking Lad, but you say it was a light kick, because he was running away when it landed. I am curious to know just how hard a kick it was. In fact, I'm so curious about it that I'm going to offer myself as a substitute for Lad. My riding boot is a good surface. Will you kindly kick me there, Schwartz, as nearly as possible with the same force, no more, no less, than you kick the dog?" "I protest!" shouted Romayne. "This measly tomfoolishness is—" "If your honor please," appealed the master sharply, turning from the bewildered Schwartz to the no less dismayed judge. Maclay was on his feet to overrule so strange a request, but there was keen supplication in the master's eye that made the judge pause. Maclay glanced again at the mistress. In spite of the prospect of seeing her husband kicked, her face wore a most pleased smile. The judge noted, though, that she was stroking Lad's head, and that she was unobtrusively turning that head so that the dog faced Schwartz. "Now then," adjured the master, "whenever you're ready, Schwartz. A German doesn't get a chance, like this, every day, to kick an American, and I'll promise not to go for your throat as Laddie tried to. Kick away." Awkwardly, shamblingly, Schwartz stepped forward. Urged on by his racial veneration for the law, and perhaps not sorry to assail the man whose dog had tried to throttle him, he drew back his broganned left foot and kicked out in the general direction of the calf of the master's thick riding boot. The kick did not land. Not that the master dodged or blocked it. He stood moveless, and grinning expectantly. But the courtroom shook with a wild beast yell, a yell of insane fury, and Schwartz drew back his half-extended left foot in sudden terror, as a great furry shape came whizzing through the air at him. The sight of the half-delivered kick at his worshipped master had precisely the effect on Lad that the mistress had foreseen when she planned the maneuver. Almost any good dog will attack a man who seeks to strike its owner, and Lad seemed to comprehend that a kick is a more contemptuous affront than is a blow. Schwartz's kick at the master had thrown the adoring dog into a maniac rage against this defiler of his idol. The memory of Schwartz's blow at himself was as nothing to it. It aroused in the collie's heart a deathless blood feud against the man, as the mistress had known it would. The mistress's sharp command and the master's hastily outflung arm barely sufficed to deflect Lad's charge. He writhed in their dual grasp, snarling furiously, his eyes red, his every giant muscle strained to get at the cowering Schwartz. "We've had enough of this," imperatively ordained Maclay, above the babble of Titus Romayne's protests. In spite of the informality of hearing,
This is a court of law, not a dog kennel. I crave your honor's pardon," apologized the master. "I was merely trying to show that Lad is not the sort of dog to let a stranger strike and kick him as this man claims to have done with impunity. I think I have shown from Lad's own regrettable actions that it was some other dog, if any, which cheered Romayne's barnyard this morning and yesterday morning." "It was your dog!" cried Schwartz, getting his breath in a swirl of anger. "Next time I'll be on watch with a shotgun and not a stick. "There ain't going to be no next time," asserted the equally angry Romayne. "Judge, I call on you to order that sheep killer shot, and to order his master to indemnify me for the loss of my 8 killed sheep." "Your honor," suavely protested the master, "may I ask you to listen to a counter-proposition, a proposition which I think will be agreeable to Mr. Romayne as well as to myself." "The only proposition I'll agree to is the shootin' of that cur and the indemnifyin' of me for my sheep," persisted Romayne. Maclay waved his hand for order, then, turning to the master, said, "State your proposition." "I propose," began the master, "that Lad be paroled in my custody for the space of 24 hours. I will deposit with the court, here and now, my bond for the sum of $1,000, to be paid, on demand, to Titus Romayne. If one or more of his sheep are killed by any dog during that space of time—" The crass oddity of the proposal set Titus's leathery mouth ajar. Even the judge gasped aloud at its bizarre terms. Schwartz looked blank, until, little by little, the purport of the words sank into his slow mind. Then he permitted himself the rare luxury of a chuckle. "Do I understand you to say," demanded Titus Romayne of the master, "that if I'll agree to hold up this case for 24 hours, you'll give me $1,000 cash for any sheep of mine that gets killed by dogs in that time?" "That is my proposition," returned the master. "To cinch it, I'll let you make out the written arrangement yourself, and I'll give the court a bond for the money, at once, with instructions that the sum is to be paid to you if you lose 1 sheep through dogs in the next day. I furthermore agree to shoot Lad myself if you lose 1 or more sheep in that time, and in that way I'll forfeit another 1,000 if I fail to keep that part of my contract. How about it?" "I agree!" exclaimed Titus. Schwartz's smile, by this time, threatened to split his broad face across. Maclay saw the mistress's cheek whiten a little, but her aspect betrayed no worry over the possible loss of $1,000, and the far more painful loss of the dog she loved. When Romayne and Schwartz had gone, the master tarried a moment in the court-room. "I can't make out what you're driving at," Maclay told him, "but you seem to me to have done a mighty foolish thing. To get $1,000 Romayne is capable of scouring the whole country for a sheep-killing dog. So is Schwartz, if only to get Lad shot. Did you see the way Schwartz looked at Lad as he went out? He hates him." "Yes," said the master, "and I saw the way Lad looked at him. Lad will never forget that kick at me. He'll attack Schwartz for it, if they come together a year from now. That's why we arranged it. Say, Mac, I want you to do me a big favor, a favor that comes within the square and angle of your work. I want you to go fishing with me to-night. Better come over to dinner, and be prepared to spend the night. The fishing won't start till about 12 o'clock." "12 o'clock!" echoed Maclay. "Why, man, nothing but catfish will bite at that hour, and I—" "You're mistaken," denied the master. "Much bigger fish will bite. Much bigger. Take my word for that. My wife and I have it all figured out. I'm not asking you in your official capacity, but as a friend. I'll need you, Mac. It will be a big favor to me. And if I'm not wrong, there'll be sport in it for you, too. I'm risking $1,000 and my dog on this fishing trip. Won't you risk a night's sleep? I ask it as a worthy and distressed—" "Certainly," assented the wholly perplexed judge, impressed. "But I don't get your idea at all. I'll explain it before we start," promised the master. "All I want now is for you to commit yourself to the scheme. If it fails, you won't lose anything except your sleep. Thanks for saying you'll come." At a little after 10 o'clock that night, the last light in Titus Romayne's farmhouse went out. A few moments later the master got up from a rock on Mount Pisgah's summit, on which he and Maclay had been sitting for the past hour. Lad, at their feet, rose expectantly with them. "Come on, old man," said the master. "We'll drop down there now. It'll probably mean a long wait for us, but it's better to be too soon than too late, when I've got so much staked. If we're seen, you can cut and run. Lad and I will cover your retreat, and see you aren't recognized. Steady there, lad. Keep it heel." Stealthily the trio made their way down the hill to the farmstead at its farther base. Silently they crept along the outer fringe of the home lot, until they came opposite the black-gabled bulk of the barn. Presently their slowly cautious progress brought them to the edge of the barnyard, and to the rail fence which surrounds it. There they halted. From within the yard, as the huddle of drowsy sheep caught the scent of the dog, came a slight stirring. But, after a moment, the yard was quiet again. "Get that?" whispered the master, his mouth close to Maclay's ear. "Those sheep are supposed to have been raided by a killer dog for the past 2 nights. Yet the smell of a dog doesn't even make them bleat. If they had been attacked by any dog last night, the scent of Lad would throw them into a panic." "I get something else, too," replied Maclay, in the same all but soundless whisper, "and I'm ashamed I didn't think of it before. Romayne said the dog wriggled into the yard through the bars, and out again the same way. Well, if those bars were wide enough apart for an 80-pound collie like Lad to get through, what would there be to prevent all these sheep from escaping, the same way, any time they wanted to? I'll have a look at those bars before I pass judgment on the case. I begin to be glad you and your wife coerced me into this adventure." "Of course the sheep could have gotten through the same bars that the dog did," answered the master. "For, didn't Romayne say the dog not only got through, but dragged 3 dead sheep through after him each night, and hid them somewhere where they couldn't be found? No man would keep sheep in a pen as open as all that. The entire story is full of air-holes." Lad, at a touch from his master, had lain softly down at the men's feet, beside the fence. And so, for another full hour, the 3 waited there. The night was heavily overcast, and, except for the low drone of distant tree-toads and crickets, it was deathly silent. Heat-lightning, once in a while, played dimly along the western horizon. "Lucky for us that Romayne doesn't keep a dog," whispered Maclay. "He'd have raised the alarm before we got within 100 yards of here. He told my foreman he gave his mongrel dog away when he stocked himself with sheep. And he's been reading a lot of rot about dogs being non-utilitarian, too. His dog would have been anything but non-utilitarian to-night." A touch on the sleeve from Maclay silenced the rambling whisper. Through the stillness a house door shut very softly, not far away. An instant later Lad growled throatily and got to his feet, tense and fiercely eager. "He's caught Schwartz's scent," whispered the master exultantly. "Now, maybe you understand why I made the man try to kick me. Down, Lad. Quiet." At the stark command in the master's whisper, Lad dropped to earth again, though he still rumbled deeply in his throat, until a touch from the master's fingers and a repeated "quiet" silenced him. The hush of the night was disturbed once more very faintly, this time by the muffled padding of a man's bare feet, drawing closer to the barnyard. Lad, as he heard it, made as if to rise. The master tapped him lightly on the head, and the dog sank to the ground again, quivering with hard-held rage. The clouds had piled thicker. Only by a dim pulsing of far-away heat-lightning could the watchers discern the shadowy outline of a man, moving silently between them and the far side of the yard. By the tiny glow of lightning they saw his silhouette. By Lad's almost uncontrollable trembling they knew who he must be. There was another drowsy stirring of the sheep, checked by the reassuring mumble of a voice the animals seemed to know. and, except for the stealthy motion of groping feet, the barnyard seemed as empty of human life as before. Perhaps a minute later another sulphur gleam of lightning revealed the intruder to the two men who crouched behind the outer angle of the fence. He had come out of the yard and was shuffling away, but he was fully a third wider of shoulder now, and he seemed to have two heads, as his silhouette dimly appeared and then vanished. "See that?" whispered the master. "He has a sheep slung over his back, probably with a cloth wrapped around its head to keep it quiet. We will give him 20 seconds start, and then—" "Good!" babbled Maclay, in true Buck-Og fever of excitement. "It worked out to a charm! But how in the blazes can we track him through this dark? It's as black as the inside of a cow, and if we show the flashlights—" "Trust Lad to track him," rejoined the master, who had been slipping a leash around the dog's low growling throat. "That's what the old fellow's here for. He has a kick to punish. He would follow Schwartz through the Sahara Desert if he had to. Come on." Lad, at a word from the master, sprang to the end of the leash, his mighty head and shoulders straining forward. The master's reiterated quiet alone kept him from giving tongue, and thus the trio started the pursuit. Lad went in a geometrically straight line, swerving not an inch, with much more difficulty held back to the slow walk on which the master insisted. There was more than one reason for this insistence. Not only did the two men want to keep far enough behind Schwartz to prevent him from hearing their careful steps, but Lad's course was so uncompromisingly straight that it led them over 100 obstacles and gullies which required all sorts of skill to negotiate. For at least 2 miles the snail-like progress continued, most of the way through woods. At last, with a gasp, the master found himself wallowing knee-deep in a bog. Maclay, a step behind him, also plunged splashingly into the soggy mire. "What's the matter with the dog?" grumpily demanded the judge. "He's led us into the Pancake Hollow swamp. Schwartz never in the world carried a 90-pound sheep through here." "Maybe not," puffed the master, "but he has carried it over one of the half-dozen paths that lead through this marsh. Lad is in too big a hurry to bother about paths. He—" 50 feet above them, on a little mid-swamp knoll, a lantern shone. Apparently it had just been lighted, for it waxed brighter in a second or so. The men saw it and strode forward at top speed. The third step caused Maclay to stumble over a hummock and land noisily on all fours in a mud pool. As he fell he swore, with a loud distinctness that rang through the swampy stillness like a pistol shot. Instantly the lantern went out, and there was a crashing in among the bushes of the knoll. "After him!" yelled Maclay, floundering to his feet. "He'll escape, and we have no real proof who he is, or—" The master, still ankle-high in sticky mud, saw the futility of trying to catch a man who, unimpeded, was running away along a dry-ground path. There was but one thing left to do, and the master did it. Loosening the leash from the dog's collar, he shouted, "Get him, laddie! Get him!" There was a sound as of a cavalry regiment galloping through shallow water, that and a queerly ecstatic growl, and the collie was gone. As fast as possible the two men made for the base of the knoll. They had drawn forth their electric torches, and these now made the progress much swifter and easier. Nevertheless, before the master had set foot on the first bit of firm ground, all pandemonium burst forth amid the darkness, above and in front of him. The turmoil's multiple sounds were indescribable, blending into one wild cacophony the yells and stamping of a fear-demented man, the bleats of sheep, the tearing of underbrush, through and above and under all, a hideous sub-note as of a rabid beast worrying its prey. It was this undercurrent of sound which put wings on the tired feet of Maclay and the master, as they dashed up the knoll and into the path leading east from it. It spoke of unpleasant, not to say gruesome, happenings. So did the swift change of the victim's yells from wrath to mortal terror. "Back, lad!" called the master, pantingly, as he ran. "Back! Let him alone!" And as he cried the command he rounded a turn in the wooded path. Prone on the ground, writhing like a cut snake and frantically seeking to guard his throat with his slashed forearm, sprawled Schwartz. Crouching above him, right unwillingly obeying the master's belated call, was Lad. The dog's great coat was abristle. His bare teeth glinted white and blood flecked in the electric flare. His soft eyes were blazing. "Back!" repeated the master. "Back here!" Absolute obedience was the first and foremost of the place's few simple dog rules. Lad had learned it from earliest puppyhood. The collie, still shaking all over with the effort of repressing his fury, turned slowly and came over to his master. There he stood stonily awaiting further orders. Maclay was on his knees beside the hysterically moaning German, roughly telling him that the dog would do him no more damage, and at the same time making a quick inspection of the injuries wrought by the slashing white fangs in the shielding arm and its shoulder. "Get up," he now ordered. "You're not too badly hurt to stand. Another minute, and he'd have gotten through to your throat. But your clothes saved you from anything worse than a few ugly flesh cuts. Get up! Stop that yowling, and get up!" Schwartz gradually lessened his dolorous plaints under the stern authority of Maclay's exhortations. Presently he sat up, and nursing his lacerated forearm, and staring about him. At sight of Lad he shuddered, and recognizing Maclay, he broke into violent and fatly accented speech. "Take witness, Judge!" he exclaimed. "I watched the barnyard to-night, and I saw that Schweinhund steal another sheep. I followed him, and when he got here he dropped the sheep and went for me. He—" "Very bad, Schwartz," disgustedly reproved Maclay. "Very bad indeed. You should have waited a minute longer and thought up a better one. But since this is the yarn you choose to tell, we'll look about and try to verify it. The sheep, for instance, the one you say Lad carried all the way here and then dropped to attack you. I seem to have heard a sheep bleating a few moments ago. Several sheep, in fact. We'll see if we can't find the one Lad stole." Schwartz jumped nervously to his feet. "Stay where you are," Maclay bade him. "We won't bother a tired and injured man to help in our search." Turning to the master, he added, "I suppose one of us will have to stand guard over him, while the other one hunts up the sheep. Shall I—" "Neither of us need do that," said the master. "Lad?" The collie started eagerly forward, and Schwartz started still more eagerly backward. "Watch him," commanded the master. "Watch him." It was an order Lad had learned to follow in the many times when the mistress and the master had left him to guard the car or to do sentry duty over some other article of value. He understood. He would have preferred to deal with this enemy according to his own lights, but the master had spoken. So, standing at view, the collie looked longingly at Schwartz's throat. "Keep perfectly still," the master warned the prisoner, "and perhaps he won't go for you. Move, and he most surely will. Watch him, laddie." Maclay and the master left the captive in his guard and set forth on a flashlight-illumined tour of the knoll. It was a desolate spot, far back in the swamp and more than a mile from any road, a place visited not 3 times a year except in the shooting season. In less than half a minute the plaintive "baa" of a sheep guided the searchers to the left of the knoll, where stood a thick birch and alder copse. Around this they circled until they reached a narrow opening where the branch ends, several feet above ground, were flecked with hanks of wool. Squirming through the aperture in single file, the investigators found what they sought. In the tight-woven copse's center was a small clearing. In this was a rudely wattled pen some 9 feet square, and in the pen were bunched 6 sheep. An occasional scared bleat from deeper in the copse told the whereabouts of the sheep Schwartz had taken from the barnyard that night, and which he had dropped at Lad's onslaught before he could put it in the pen. On the ground, just outside the enclosure, lay the smashed lantern. "Sheep on the hoof are worth $12.50 per at the Paterson market," mused the master aloud, as Maclay blinked owlishly at the treasure trove. "There are $75 worth of sheep in that pen, and there would have been 3 or more of them before morning if we hadn't butted in on Herr Schwartz's overtime labors. To get 3 sheep at night, it was well worth his while to switch suspicion to Lad by killing a 4th sheep every time, and mangling its throat with a stripping knife. Only he mangled it too efficiently. There was too much culture about the mangling. It wasn't ragged enough. That's what first gave me my idea. That, and the way the missing sheep always vanished into more or less thin air. You see, he probably—" "But," sputtered Maclay, "why 4 each night? Why—" "You saw how long it took him to get one of them here," replied the master. "He didn't dare to start until the Romaines were asleep, and he had to be back in time to catch Lad at the slaughter before Titus got out of bed. He wouldn't dare hide them any nearer home. Titus has spent most of his time both days in hunting for them. Schwartz was probably waiting to get the pen nice and full. Then he'd take a day off to visit his relatives, and he'd round up this tidy bunch and drive them over to the Ridgewood Road, through the woods, and so on to the Patterson Market. It was a pretty little scheme all around." "But," urged Maclay, as they turned back to where Lad still kept his avid vigil, "I still hold you were taking big chances and gambling $1,000 and your dog's life that Schwartz would do the same thing again within 24 hours. He might have waited a day or two till—" "No," contradicted the master. "That's just what he mightn't do. You see, I wasn't perfectly sure whether it was Schwartz or Romaine, or both, who were mixed up in this, so I set the trap at both ends. If it was Romaine, it was worth $1,000 to him to have more sheep killed within 24 hours. If it was Schwartz, well, that's why I made him try to hit Lad, and why I made him try to kick me. The dog went for him both times, and that was enough to make Schwartz want him killed for his own safety, as well as for revenge. So he was certain to arrange another killing within the 24 hours, if only to force me to shoot Lad. He couldn't steal or kill sheep by daylight. I picked the only hours he could do it in. If he'd gotten Lad killed, he'd probably have invented another sheep-killer dog to help him swipe the rest of the flock. Or until Romaine decided to do the watching. It was clever of you," cordially admitted Maclay. "Mighty clever, old man. It was my wife who worked it out, you know," the master reminded him. "I admit my own cleverness, of course. Only, like a lot of men's money, it's all in my wife's name. Come on, Lad. You can guard Herr Schwartz just as well by walking behind him. We're going to wind up the evening's fishing trip by tendering a surprise party to dear, genial old Mr. Titus Romaine. I hope the flashlights will hold out long enough for me to get a clear look at his face when he sees us." End of Chapter 10. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida. Chapter 11 of Lad, a Dog by Albert Payson Terhune. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Greg Giordano. Chapter 11 Wolf. There were but 3 collies on the place in those days. There was a long shelf in the master's study, whereupon shimmered and glinted a rank of silver cups of varying sizes and shapes. 2 of the place's dogs had won them all. Above the shelf hung 2 huge picture frames. In the center of each was the small photograph of a collie. Beneath each likeness was a certified pedigree, a bristle with the red-letter names of champions. Surrounding the pictures and pedigrees, the whole remaining space in both frames was filled with blue ribbons. The very meanest bit of silk in either was a semi-occasional reserve winners, while, strung along the tops of the frames from side to side, ran a line of medals. Cups, medals, and ribbons alike had been won by the place's 2 great collies, Lad and Bruce. Those were their kennel names. Their official titles on the A.K.C. registry list were high-sounding and needlessly long. Lad was growing old. His reign on the place was drawing toward a benignant close.
His muzzle was almost snow white, and his once graceful lines were beginning to show the oncoming heaviness of age. No longer could he hope to hold his own, in form and carriage, with younger collies at the local dog shows, where once he had carried all before him. Bruce Sunnybank Goldsmith was 6 years Lad's junior. He was tawny of coat, kingly of bearing, a dog without a fault of body or of disposition, stately as the boarhounds that the painters of old used to love to depict in their portraits of monarchs. The Place's third collie was Lad's son, Wolf, but neither cup nor ribbon did Wolf have to show as an excuse for his presence on earth, nor would he have won recognition in the smallest and least exclusive collie show. For Wolf was a collie only by courtesy. His breeding was as pure as was any champion's, but he was one of those luckless types to be found in nearly every litter, a throwback to some forgotten ancestor whose points were all defective. Not even the glorious pedigree of Lad, his father, could make Wolf look like anything more than he was, a dog without a single physical trait that followed the best collie standards. In spite of all this he was beautiful. His gold and white coat was almost as bright and luxuriant as any prize winner's. He had, in a general way, the collie head and brush, but an expert, at the most casual glance, would have noted a shortness of nose and breadth of jaw and a shape of ear and shoulder that told dead against him. The collie is supposed to be descended direct from the wolf, and Wolf looked far more like his original ancestors than like a thoroughbred collie. From puppyhood he had been the living image, except in color, of a timber wolf, and it was from this queer throwback trait that he had won his name. Lad was the mistress's dog. Bruce was the master's. Wolf belonged to the boy, having been born on the latter's birthday. For the first 6 months of his life, Wolf lived at the Place on sufferance. Nobody except the boy took any special interest in him. He was kept only because his better formed brothers had died in early puppyhood, and because the boy, from the outset, had loved him. At 6 months it was discovered that he was a natural watchdog, also that he never barked except to give an alarm. A collie is, perhaps, the most excitable of all large dogs. The veriest trifle will set him off into a thunderous paroxysm of barking. But Wolf, the boy noted, never barked without strong cause. He had the rare genius for guarding that so few of his breed possess, for not 1 dog in 10 merits the title of watchdog. The duties that should go with that office are far more than the mere clamorous announcement of a stranger's approach, or even the attacking of such a stranger. The born watchdog patrols his beat once in so often during the night. At all times he must sleep with 1 ear and 1 eye alert. By day or by night he must discriminate between the visitor, whose presence is permitted, and the trespasser, whose presence is not. He must know what class of undesirable to scare off with a growl, and what class needs stronger measures. He must also know to the inch the boundaries of his own master's land. Few of these things can be taught. All of them must be instinctive. Wolf had been born with them. Most dogs are not. His value as a watchdog gave Wolf a settled position of his own on the Place. Lad was growing old and a little deaf. He slept at night under the piano in the music-room. Bruce was worth too much money to be left at large in the night-time for any clever dog-thief to steal, so he slept in the study. Rex, a huge mongrel, was tied up at night at the lodge a furlong away. Thus Wolf alone was left on guard at the house. The piazza was his sentry box. From this shelter he was wont to set forth 3 or 4 times a night, in all sorts of weather, to make his rounds. The Place covered 25 acres. It ran from the high road, a furlong above the house, down to the lake that bordered it on 2 sides. On the third side was the forest. Boating parties, late at night, had a pleasant way of trying to raid the lakeside apple orchard. Tramps now and then strayed down the drive from the main road. Prowlers, crossing the woods, sometimes sought to use the place's sloping lawn as a short cut to the turnpike below the falls. For each and all of these intruders Wolf had an ever-ready welcome. A whirl of madly pattering feet through the dark, a snarling growl far down in the throat, a furry shape catapulting into the air, and the trespasser had his choice between a scurrying retreat or a double set of white fangs in the easiest reached part of his anatomy. The boy was inordinately proud of his pet's watchdog prowess. He was prouder yet of Wolf's almost incredible sharpness of intelligence, his quickness to learn, his knowledge of word meaning, his zest for romping, his perfect obedience, the tricks he had taught himself without human tutelage. In short, all the things that were a sign of the brain he had inherited from Lad. But none of these talents overcame the sad fact that Wolf was not a show dog, and that he looked positively underbred and shabby alongside of his sire or of Bruce, which rankled at the boy's heart, even while loyalty to his adored pet would not let him confess to himself or to anyone else that Wolf was not the most flawlessly perfect dog on earth. Undersized for a collie, slim, graceful, fierce, affectionate, Wolf was the boy's darling, and he was Lad's successor as official guardian of the place. But all his youthful life thus far had brought him nothing more than this, while Lad and Bruce had been winning prize after prize at one local dog show after another within a radius of 30 miles. The boy was duly enthusiastic over the winning of each trophy, but always, for days thereafter, he was more than usually attentive to Wolf to make up for his pet's dearth of prizes. Once or twice the boy had hinted, in a veiled, tentative way, that young Wolf might perhaps win something too, if he were allowed to go to a show. The master, never suspecting what lay behind the cautious words, would always laugh in good-natured derision, or else he would point in silence to Wolf's head and then to Lad's. The boy knew enough about collies to carry the subject no further, for even his eyes of devotion could not fail to mark the difference in aspect between his dog and the two prize winners. One July morning both Lad and Bruce went through an hour of anguish. Both of them, one after the other, were plunged into a bathtub full of warm water in naphtha soapsuds and Lux, and were scrubbed right unmercifully, after which they were rubbed and curried and brushed for another hour until their coats shone resplendent. All day, at intervals, the brushing and combing were kept up. Lad was indignant at such treatment, and he took no pains to hide his indignation. He knew perfectly well, from the undue attention, that a dog show was at hand, but not for a year or more had he himself been made ready for one. His lake baths and his daily casual brushing at the mistress's hands had been, in that time, his only form of grooming. He had thought himself graduated forever from the nuisance of going to shows. "What's the idea of dolling up old Laddie like that?" asked the boy, as he came in for luncheon and found the mistress busy with comb and dandy brush over the unhappy dog. "For the 4th of July Red Cross Dog Show at Ridgewood to-morrow," answered his mother, looking up, a little flushed from her exertions. "But I thought you and Dad said last year he was too old to show any more," ventured the boy. "This time is different," said the mistress. "It's a specialty show, you see, and there's a cup offered for the very best veteran dog of any recognized breed. Isn't that fine? We didn't hear of the veteran cup till Dr. Hooper telephoned to us about it this morning. So we're getting Lad ready. There can't be any other veteran as splendid as he is." "No," agreed the boy dully, "I suppose not." He went into the dining room, surreptitiously helped himself to a handful of lump sugar, and passed on out to the veranda. Wolf was sprawled half asleep on the driveway lawn in the sun. The dog's wolf-like brush began to thump against the shaven grass. Then, as the boy stood on the veranda edge and snapped his fingers, Wolf got up from his soft resting place and started toward him, treading mincingly and with a sort of swagger, his slanting eyes half shut, his mouth a grin. "You know I've got sugar in my pocket as well as if you saw it," said the boy. "Stop where you are." Though the boy accompanied his order with no gesture nor change of tone, the dog stopped dead short 10 feet away. "Sugar is bad for dogs," went on the boy. "It does things to their teeth and their digestions. Didn't anybody ever tell you that, Wolfie?" The young dog's grin grew wider. His slanting eyes closed to mere glittering slits. He fidgeted a little, his tail wagging fast. "But I guess a dog's got to have some kind of consolation purse when he can't go to a show," resumed the boy. "Catch!" As he spoke he suddenly threw a lump of sugar from his pocket, and, with the same motion, tossed it in the direction of Wolf. Swift as was the boy's action, Wolf's eye was still quicker. Springing high in air, the dog caught the flung cube of sugar as it flew above him and to one side. A second and a third lump were caught as deftly as the first. Then the boy took from his pocket the fourth and last lump. Descending the steps, he put his left hand across Wolf's eyes. With his right he flipped the lump of sugar into a clump of shrubbery. "Find it," he commanded, lifting the blindfold from the eyes of his pet. Wolf darted hither and thither, stopped once or twice to sniff, then began to circle the nearer stretch of lawn, nose to ground. In less than 2 minutes he emerged from the shrubbery, placidly crunching the sugar lump between his mighty jaws. "And yet they say you aren't fit to be shown!" exclaimed the boy, fondling the dog's ears. "Gee, but I'd give 2 years' growth if you could have a cup. You deserve one, all right, if only those judges had sense enough to study a collie's brain as well as the outside of his head." Wolf ran his nose into the cupped palm and whined. From the tone underlying the words, he knew the boy was unhappy, and he wanted to be of help. The boy went into the house again to find his parents sitting down to lunch. Gathering his courage in both hands, he asked, "Is there going to be a novice class for collies at Ridgewood, Dad?" "Why, yes," said the master. "I suppose so. There always is." Do they give cups for the novice class?" inquired the boy, with studied carelessness. "Of course they don't," said the master, adding reminiscently, "though the first time we showed Lad, we put him in the novice class, and he won the blue ribbon there, so we had to go into the winner's class afterward. He got the winner's cup, you remember. So, indirectly, the novice class won him a cup." "I see," said the boy, not at all interested in this bit of ancient history. Then, speaking very fast, he went on, "Well, a ribbon's better than nothing. Dad, will you do me a favor? Will you let me enter Wolfie for the novice class tomorrow? I'll pay the fee out of my allowance. Will you, Dad?" The master looked at his son in blank amazement. Then he threw back his head and laughed loudly. The boy flushed crimson and bit his lips. "Why, dear," hurriedly interposed the mistress, noting her son's discomfiture, "you wouldn't want Wolf to go there and be beaten by a lot of dogs that haven't half his brains or prettiness. It wouldn't be fair or kind to Wolf. He's so clever, he'd know in a moment what was happening. He'd know he was beaten. Nearly all dogs do. No, it wouldn't be fair to him." "There's a mutt class among the specials, Dr. Hopper says," put in the master, jocosely. "You might—" "Wolf's not a mutt," flashed the boy hotly. "He's no more of a mutt than Bruce or Lad or Grey Mist or Southport Sample or any of the best ones. He has as good blood as all of them. Lad's his father, and Squire of Tytton was his grandfather, and Weeshall Clinker was his—" "I'm sorry, son," interposed the master, catching his wife's eye and dropping his tone of banter. "I apologize to you and Wolf. He's not a mutt. There's no better blood in colliedom than his, on both sides. But mother is right. You'd only be putting him up to be beaten, and you wouldn't like that. He hasn't a single point that isn't hopelessly bad from a judge's view. We've never taken a loser to a show from the place. You don't want us to begin now, do you? He has more brains than any dog alive, except Lad," declared the boy sullenly. "That ought to count." "It ought to," agreed the mistress soothingly, "and I wish it did. If it did, I know he'd win."
"It makes me sick to see a bushel of cups go to dogs that don't know enough to eat their own dinners," snorted the boy. "I'm not talking about Lad and Bruce, but the thoroughbreds that are brought up in kennels, and that have all their sense sacrificed for points. Why, Wolf's the cleverest, best, and he'll never even have one cup to show for it. He choked and began to eat at top speed. The master and the mistress looked at each other and said nothing. They understood their son's chagrin, as only a dog lover could understand it. The mistress reached out and patted the boy gently on the shoulder. Next morning, directly after early breakfast, Lad and Bruce were put into the tonneau of the car. The mistress and the master and the boy climbed in, and the 12-mile journey to Ridgewood began. Wolf, left to guard the place, watched the departing show-goers until the car turned out of the gate a furlong above. Then, with a sigh, he curled up on the porch mat, his nose between his snowy little paws, and prepared for a day of loneliness. The Red Cross Dog Show that 4th of July was a triumph for the place. Bruce won ribbon after ribbon in the collie division, easily taking winners at the last, and thus adding another gorgeous silver cup to his collection. Then, the supreme event of the day, Best Dog in the Show, was called, and the winners of each breed were led into the ring. The judges scanned and handled the group of 16 for barely 5 minutes before awarding to Bruce the dark blue rosette and the Best Dog Cup. The crowd around the ring's railing applauded loudly, but they applauded still more loudly a little later, when, after a brief survey of 9 aged thoroughbreds, the judge pointed to Lad, who was standing like a mahogany statue at one end of the ring. These 9 dogs of various breeds had all been famed prize winners in their time, and above all the rest, Lad was adjudged worthy of the Veteran Cup. There was a haze of happy tears in the mistress's eyes as she led him from the ring. It seemed a beautiful climax for his grand old life. She wiped her eyes, unashamed, whispering praise the while to her stately dog. "Why don't you trundle your car into the ring?" one disgruntled exhibitor demanded of the mistress. "Maybe you'd win a cup with that, too. You seem to have gotten one for everything else you brought along." It was a celebration evening for the 2 prize dogs when they got home, but everybody was tired from the day's events, and by 10 o'clock the house was dark. Wolf, on his veranda mat, alone of all the place's denizens, was awake. Vaguely Wolf knew the other dogs had done some praiseworthy thing. He would have known it, if for no other reason, from the remorseful hug the boy had given him before going to bed. Well, some must win honors and petting and the right to sleep indoors, while others must plod along at the only work they were fit for, and must sleep out, in thunderstorm or clear, in heat or freezing cold. That was life. Being only a dog, Wolf was too wise to complain of life. He took things as he found them, making the very best of his share. He snoozed now in the warm darkness. 2 hours later he got up, stretched himself lazily fore and aft, collie fashion, and trotted forth for the night's first patrol of the grounds. A few minutes afterward he was skirting the lake edge at the foot of the lawn, 100 yards below the house. The night was pitch dark, except for the pulses of heat lightning, now and then, far to westward. Half a mile out on the lake 2 men in an anchored scow were catfishing. A small skiff was slipping along very slowly not 50 feet offshore. Wolf did not give the skiff a second glance. Boats were no novelty to him, nor did they interest him in the least, except when they showed signs of running ashore somewhere along his beat. This skiff was not headed for land, but was paralleling the shore. It crept along at a snail pace, and in dead silence. A man, its only occupant, sat at the oars, scarcely moving them as he kept his boat in motion. A dog is ridiculously near-sighted, more so than almost any other beast. Keen hearing and keener scent are its chief guides. At 300 yards distance it cannot, by eye, recognize its master, nor tell him from a stranger, but at close quarters, even in the darkest night, a dog's vision is far more piercing and accurate than man's under like conditions.
Wolf thus saw the skiff and its occupant, while he himself was still invisible. The boat was no concern of his, so he trotted on to the far end of the place, where the forest joined the orchard. On his return tour of the lake edge he saw the skiff again. It had shifted its direction and was now barely 10 feet off shore, so near to the bank that one of the oars occasionally grated on the pebbly bottom. The oarsman was looking intently toward the house. Wolf paused, uncertain. The average watchdog, his attention thus attracted, would have barked. But Wolf knew the lake was public property. Boats are often rowed as close to shore as this without intent to trespass. It was not the skiff that caught Wolf's attention as he paused there on the brink. It was the man's furtive scrutiny of the house. A pale flare of heat lightning turned the world momentarily from jet black to a dim sulphur color. The boatman saw Wolf standing, alert and suspicious, among the lakeside grasses not 10 feet away. He started slightly, and a soft, throaty growl from the dog answered him. The man seemed to take the growl as a challenge, and to accept it. He reached into his pocket and drew something out. When the next faint glow of lightning illumined the shore, the man lifted the thing he had taken from his pocket and hurled it at Wolf. With all the furtive swiftness bred in his wolf ancestry, the dog shrank to one side, readily dodging the missile, which struck the lawn just behind him. Teeth bared in a ferocious snarl, Wolf dashed forward through the shallow water toward the skiff. But the man apparently had had enough of the business. He rowed off with long strokes into deep water, and, once there, he kept on rowing until distance and darkness hid him. Wolf stood chest-deep in water, listening to the far-off oar-strokes until they died away. He was not fool enough to swim in pursuit, well knowing that a swimming dog is worse than helpless against a boatman. Moreover, the intruder had been scared away. That was all which concerned Wolf. He turned back to shore. His vigil was ended for another few hours. It was time to take up his nap where he had left off. Before he had taken 2 steps, his sensitive nostrils were full of the scent of raw meat. There, on the lawn ahead of him, lay a chunk of beef as big as a fist. This, then, was what the boatman had thrown at him. Wolf pricked up his ears in appreciation, and his brush began to vibrate. Trespassers had once or twice tried to stone him, but this was the first time any of them had pelted him with delicious raw beef. Evidently Lad and Bruce were not the only collies on the place to receive prizes that day. Wolf stooped over the meat, sniffed at it, then caught it up between his jaws. Now, a dog is the easiest animal alive to poison, just as a cat is the hardest, for a dog will usually bolt a mouthful of poisoned meat without pausing to chew or otherwise investigate it. A cat, on the contrary, smells and tastes everything first, and chews it scientifically before swallowing it. The slightest unfamiliar scent or flavor warns her to sheer off from the feast. So the average dog would have gulped this toothsome windfall in a single swallow. But Wolf was not the average dog. No collie is, and Wolf was still more like his eccentric forefathers of the wilderness than are most collies. He lacked the reasoning powers to make him suspicious of this rich gift from a stranger, but a queer personal trait now served him just as well. Wolf was an epicure. He always took 3 times as long to empty his dinner dish as did the other dogs. For instead of gobbling his meal, as they did, he was wont to nibble affectedly at each morsel, gnawing it slowly into nothingness, and all the time showing a fussily dainty relish of it that used to delight the boy and send guests into peals of laughter. This odd little trait that had caused so much ridicule now saved Wolf's life. He carried the lump of beef gingerly up to the veranda, laid it down on his mat, and prepared to revel in this chance banquet after his own deliberate fashion. Holding the beef between his forepaws, he proceeded to devour it in mincing little squirrel bites. About a quarter of the meat had disappeared when Wolf became aware that his tongue smarted and that his throat was sore. Also that the interior of the meat ball had a ranking, pungent odor, very different from the heavenly fragrance of its outside and not at all appetizing. He looked down at the chunk, rolled it over with his nose, surveyed it again, then got up and moved away from it in angry disgust.
Presently he forgot his disappointment in the knowledge that he was very, very ill. His tongue and throat no longer burned, but his body and brain seemed full of hot lead that weighed a ton. He felt stupid and too weak to stir. A great drowsiness gripped him. With a grunt of discomfort and utter fatigue, he slumped down on the veranda floor to sleep off his sick lassitude. After that, for a time, nothing mattered. For perhaps an hour Wolf lay sprawling there, dead to his duty and to everything else. Then faintly, through the fog of dullness that enwrapped his brain, came a sound he had long ago learned to listen for, the harshly scraping noise of a boat's prow drawn up on the pebbly shore at the foot of the lawn. Instinct tore through the poisoned vapors and roused the sick dog. He lifted his head. It was strangely heavy and hard to lift. The sound was repeated as the prow was pulled farther up on the bank. Then came the crunch of a human foot on the waterside grass. Heredity and training and lifelong fidelity took control of the lethargic dog, dragging him to his feet and down the veranda steps through no volition of his own. Every motion tired him. He was dizzy and nauseated. He craved sleep, but as he was just a thoroughbred dog and not a wise human, he did not stop to think up good reasons why he should shirk his duty because he did not feel like performing it. To the brow of the hill he trotted, slowly, heavily, shakily. His sharp powers of hearing told him the trespasser had left his boat and had taken one or two stealthy steps up the slope of lawn toward the house. And now a puff of west wind brought Wolf's sense of smell into action. A dog remembers odors as humans remember faces, and the breeze bore to him the scent of the same man who had flung ashore that bit of meat which had caused all his suffering. He had caught the man's scent an hour earlier as he had stood sniffing at the boat 10 feet away from him. The same scent had been on the meat the man had handled. And now, having played such a cruel trick on him, the joker was actually daring to intrude on the place. A gust of resentful rage pierced the dullness of Wolf's brain and sent a thrill of fierce energy through him. For the moment this carried him out of his sick self and brought back all his former zest as a watchdog. Down the hill, like a furry whirlwind, flew Wolf, every tooth bared, his back a-bristle from neck to tail. Now he was well within sight of the intruder. He saw the man pausing to adjust something to one of his hands. Then, before this could be accomplished, Wolf saw him pause and stare through the darkness as the wild onrush of the dog's feet struck upon his hearing. Another instant, and Wolf was near enough to spring. Out of the blackness he launched himself, straight for the trespasser's face. The man saw the dim shape hurtling through the air toward him. He dropped what he was carrying and flung up both hands to guard his neck. At that he was none too soon, for just as the thief's palms reached his own throat, Wolf's teeth met in the fleshy part of the hand. Silent in agony, the man beat at the dog with his free hand, but an attacking collie is hard to locate in the darkness. A bulldog will secure a grip and will hang on. A collie is everywhere at once. Wolf's snapping jaws had already deserted the robber's mangled hand and slashed the man's left shoulder to the bone. Then the dog made another furious lunge for the face. Down crashed the man, losing his balance under the heavy impact, Wolf atop of him. To guard his throat, the man rolled over on his face, kicking madly at the dog and reaching back for his own hip pocket. Half in the water and half on the bank, the two rolled and thrashed and struggled, the man panting and wheezing in mortal terror, the dog growling in a hideous, snarling fashion as might a wild animal. The thief's torn left hand found a grip on Wolf's fur-armored throat. He shoved the fiercely writhing dog backward, jammed a pistol against Wolf's head, and pulled the trigger. The dog relaxed his grip and tumbled in a huddled heap on the brink. The man staggered, gasping to his feet, bleeding, disheveled, his clothes torn and mud-coated. The echoes of the shot were still reverberating among the lakeside hills. Several of the house's dark windows leaped into sudden light, then more windows in another room and in another. The thief swore roundly. His night's work was ruined. He bent to his skiff and shoved it into the water, then he turned to grope for what he had dropped on the lawn when Wolf's unexpected attack had interfered with his plans.
As he did so, something seized him by the ankle. In panic terror the man screamed aloud and jumped into the water. Then, peering back, he saw what had happened. Wolf, sprawling and unable to stand, had reached forward from where he lay and had driven his teeth for the last time into his foe. The thief raised his pistol again and fired at the prostrate dog. Then he clambered into his boat and rowed off with frantic speed, just as a salvo of barks told that Lad and Bruce had been released from the house. They came charging down the lawn, the master at their heels. But already the quick oar beats were growing distant, and the gloom had blotted out any chance of seeing or following the boat. Wolf lay on his side, half in and half out of the water. He could not rise, as was his custom, to meet the boy, who came running up, close behind the master and valorously grasping a target rifle. But the dog wagged his tail in feeble greeting. Then he looked out over the black lake and snarled. The bullet had grazed Wolf's scalp, and then had passed along the foreleg, scarring and numbing it. No damage had been done that a week's good nursing would not set right. The marks in the grass and the poisoned meat on the porch told their own tale. So did the neat kit of burglar tools in a rubber glove found near the foot of the lawn. And then the telephone was put to work. At dawn, a man in torn and muddy clothes called at the office of a doctor 3 miles away to be treated for a half-dozen dog bites received, he said, from a pack of stray curs he had met on the turnpike. By the time his wounds were dressed, the sheriff and 2 deputies had arrived to take him in charge. In his pockets were a revolver with 2 cartridges fired, and the mate of the rubber glove he had left on the place's lawn. You wouldn't let Wolfie go to any show and win a cup for himself," half sobbed the boy, as the master worked over the injured dog's wound. "But he saved you from losing all the cups the other dogs ever won." 3 days later the master came home from a trip to the city. He went directly to the boy's room. There on a rug lounged the convalescent Wolf, the boy sitting beside him, stroking the dog's bandaged head. "Wolf," said the master solemnly, "I've been talking about you to some people I know, and we all agree—" "Agree what?" asked the boy, looking up in mild curiosity. The master cleared his throat and continued. "We agree that the trophy shelf in my study hasn't enough cups on it, so I've decided to add still another to the collection. Want to see it, son?" From behind his back the master produced a gleaming silver cup, one of the largest and most ornate the boy had ever seen, larger even than Bruce's best dog cup. The boy took it from his father's outstretched hand. "Who won this?" he asked, "and what for? Did we get all the cups that were coming to us at the shows? Is it—" The boy's voice trailed away into a gurgle of bewildered rapture. He had caught sight of the lettering on the big cup, and now, his arm around Wolf, he read the inscription aloud, stammering with delight as he blurted out the words: "Hero Cup, won by Wolf, against all comers." End of chapter 11. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida. Chapter 12 of Lad, a Dog by Albert Payson Terhune. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Greg Giordano. Chapter 12 In the Day of Battle. Now this is the true tale of Lad's last great adventure. For more years than he could remember, Lad had been king. He had ruled at the place, from boundary fence to boundary fence, from highway to lake. He had had, as subjects, many a thoroughbred collie, and many a lesser animal and bird among the little folk of the place. His rule of them all had been lofty and beneficent. The other dogs at the place recognized Lad's rulership, recognized it without demur. It would no more have occurred to any of them, for example, to pass in or out through a doorway ahead of Lad than it would occur to a courtier to shoulder his way into the throne-room ahead of his sovereign. Nor would one of them intrude on the cave under the living-room piano, which for more than a decade had been Lad's favorite resting place. Great was Lad, and now he was old, very old. He was 13, which is equivalent to the human age of 70. His long, clean lines had become blurred with flesh. He was undeniably stout. When he ran fast, he rolled slightly in his stride. Nor could he run as rapidly or as long as of yore. While he was not wheezy or asthmatic, yet a brisk 5-mile walk would make him strangely anxious for an hour's rest. He would not confess, even to himself, that age was beginning to hamper him so cruelly, and he sought to do all the things he had once done, if the mistress or the master were looking. But when he was alone, or with the other dogs, he spared himself every needless step, and he slept a great deal. Withal, Lad's was a hale old age. His spirit and his almost uncanny intelligence had not faltered. Save for the silvered muzzle, first outward sign of age in a dog, his face and head were as classically young as ever. So were the absurdly small forepaws, his one gross vanity, on which he spent hours of care each day to keep them clean and snowy. He would still dash out of the house as of old, with the wild trumpeting bark which he reserved as greeting to his two deities alone, when the mistress or the master returned home after an absence. He would still frisk excitedly around either of them at hint of a romp. But the exertion was an exertion. And despite Lad's valiant efforts at youthfulness, everyone could see it was. No longer did he lead the other dogs in their headlong rushes through the forest in quest of rabbits. Since he could not now keep the pace, he let the others go on these breath and strength-taking excursions without him, and he contented himself with an occasional lone and stately walk through the woods, where once he had led the run, strolling along in leisurely fashion, with the benign dignity of some plump and ruddy old squire inspecting his estate. There had been many dogs at the place during the 13 years of Lad's reign, dogs of all sorts and conditions, including Lad's worshipped collie mate, the dainty gold and white lady. But in this latter day there were but 3 dogs beside himself. One of them was Wolf, the only surviving son of Lad and Lady, a slender, powerful young collie, with some of his sire's brain and much of his mother's appealing grace, an ideal play dog. Between Lad and Wolf there had always been a bond of warmest affection. Lad had trained this son of his, and had taught him all he knew. He unbent from his lofty dignity with Wolf, as with none of the others. The second of the remaining dogs was Bruce, Sunnybank goldsmith, tawny as Lad himself, descendant of 11 international champions, and winner of many a ribbon and medal and cup. Bruce was, and is, flawless in physical perfection and in obedience and intelligence. The third was Rex, a giant, a freak, a dog oddly out of place among a group of thoroughbreds. On his father's side Rex was pure collie, on his mother's pure bull-terrier. That is an accidental blending of 2 breeds which cannot blend. He looked more like a fawn-colored Great Dane than anything else. He was short-haired, full 2 inches taller and 10 pounds heavier than Lad, and had the bunch-muscled jaws of a killer. There was not an outlander dog for 2 miles in either direction that Rex had not at one time or another met and vanquished. The bull-terrier strain, which blended so ill with collie blood, made its possessor a terrific fighter. He was swift as a deer, strong as a puma. In many ways he was a lovable and affectionate pet, slavishly devoted to the master and grievously jealous of the latter's love for Lad. Rex was 5 years old, in his fullest prime, and, like the rest, he had ever taken Lad's rulership for granted. I have written at perhaps prosy length, introducing these characters of my war story. The rest is action. March, that last year, was a month of drearily recurrent snows. In the forests beyond the place, the snow lay light and fluffy at a depth of 16 inches. On a snowy, blowy, bitter-cold Sunday, one of those days nobody wants, Rex and Wolf elected to go rabbit hunting. Bruce was not in the hunt, sensibly preferring to lie in front of the living-room fire on so vile a day rather than to flounder through dust-fine drifts in search of game that was not worth chasing under such conditions. Wolf, too, was monstrous comfortable on the old fur rug by the fire, at the mistress's feet. But Rex, who had waxed oddly restless of late, was bored by the indoor afternoon. The mistress was reading, the master was asleep. There seemed no chance that either would go for a walk or otherwise amuse their four-footed friends. The winter forests were calling. The powerful cross-bred dog would find the snow a scant obstacle to his hunting, and the warmly quivering body of a new-caught rabbit was a tremendous lure. Rex got to his feet, slouched across the living-room to Bruce, and touched his nose. The drowsing collie paid no heed. Next Rex moved over to where Wolf lay. The two dogs' noses touched. Now this is no Mowgli tale, but a true narrative. I do not pretend to say whether or not dogs have a language of their own. Personally, I think they have, and a very comprehensive one, too, but I cannot prove it. No dog student, however, will deny that two dogs communicate their wishes to each other in some way, by, or during, the swift contact of noses. By that touch, Wolf understood Rex's hint to join in the foray. Wolf was not yet 4 years old, at an age when excitement still outweighs lazy comfort. Moreover, he admired and aped Rex as much as ever the school's littlest boy models himself on the class bully. He was up at once and ready to start. A maid was bringing in an armful of wood from the veranda. The two dogs slipped out through the half-open door. As they went, Wolf cast a sidelong glance at Lad, who was snoozing under the piano. Lad noted the careless invitation. He also noted that Wolf did not hesitate when his father refused to join the outing, but trotted gaily off in Rex's wake. Perhaps this defection hurt Lad's abnormally sensitive feelings, for of old he had always led such forest runnings. Perhaps the two dogs' departure merely awoke in him the memory of the chase's joys and stirred a longing for the snow-clogged woods. For a minute or two the big living-room was quiet, except for the scratch of dry snow against the panes, the slow breathing of Bruce, and the turning of a page in the book the mistress was reading. Then Lad got up heavily and walked forth from his piano cave. He stretched himself and crossed to the mistress's chair. There he sat down on the rug very close beside her, and laid one of his ridiculously tiny white forepaws in her lap. Absent-mindedly, still absorbed in her book, she put out a hand and patted the soft fur of his ruff and ears. Often Lad came to her or to the master for some such caress, and, receiving it, would return to his resting place. But today he was seeking to attract her notice for something much more important. It had occurred to him that it would be jolly to go with her for a tramp in the snow, and his mere presence failing to convey the hint, he began to talk. To the mistress and the master alone did Lad condescend to talk, and then only in moments of stress or appeal. No one, hearing him at such a time, could doubt the dog was trying to frame human speech. His vocal efforts ran the gamut of the entire scale. Wordless, but decidedly eloquent, this talking would continue sometimes for several minutes, without ceasing. Its tones carried whatever emotion the old dog sought to convey, whether of joy, of grief, of request, or of complaint. To-day there was merely playful entreaty in the speechless speech. The mistress looked up. "What is it, laddie?" she asked. "What do you want?" For answer Lad glanced at the door, then at the mistress. Then he solemnly went out into the hall, whence presently he returned with one of her fur gloves in his mouth. "No, no," she laughed. "Not to-day, Lad. Not in this storm. We'll take a good long walk to-morrow." The dog sighed, and returned sadly to his lair beneath the piano. But the vision of the forests was evidently hard to erase from his mind, and a little later, when the front door was opened again by one of the servants, he stalked out. The snow was driving hard, and there was a sting in it. The thermometer was little above 0, but the snow had been a familiar bedfellow for centuries. to Lad's Scottish forefathers, and the cold was harmless against the woven thickness of his tawny coat. Picking his way in stately fashion along the ill-broken track of the driveway, he strolled toward the woods. To humans there was nothing in the outdoor day but snow and chill and bluster and bitter loneliness. To the trained eye and the miraculous scent power of a collie, it contained a million things of dramatic interest. Here a rabbit had crossed the trail, not with leisurely bounds or mincing hops, but stomach to earth, in flight for very life. Here, close at the terrified bunny's heels, had darted a red fox. Yonder, where the piling snow covered a swirl of tracks, the chase had ended. The little ridge of snow-heaped furrow to the right held a basketful of cowering quail, who heard Lad's slow step and did not reckon on his flawless gift of smell. On the hemlock tree just ahead a hawk had lately torn a blue jay asunder. A fluff of gray feathers still stuck to a bough, and the scent of blood had not been blown out of the air. Underneath, a field mouse was plowing its way into the frozen earth, its tiny paw scrapes wholly audible to the ears of the dog above it. Here, through the stark and drifted undergrowth, Rex and Wolf had recently swept along in pursuit of a half-grown rabbit. Even a human eye could not have missed their partly covered tracks, but Lad knew whose track was whose, and which dog had been in the lead. Yes, to humans the forest would have seemed a deserted white waste. Lad knew it was thick populated with the little people of the woodland, and that all day and all night the seemingly empty and placid groves were a blend of battlefield, slaughter-house, and restaurant. Here, as much as in the cities or in the trenches, abode strenuous life, violent death, struggle, greed, and terror. A partridge rocketed upward through a clump of evergreen, while a weasel, jaws a-quiver, glared after it baffled. A shaggy owl crouched at a tree-limb hole and blinked sulkily about in search of prey and in hope of dusk. A crow, its black feet red with a slain snowbird's blood, flapped clumsily overhead. A poet would have vowed this still and white-shrouded wilderness was a shrine sacred to solitude and severe peace. Lad could have told him better. Nature, beneath the surface, is never solitary and never at peace. When a dog is very old and very heavy and a little unwieldy, it is hard to walk through 16-inch snow, even if one moves slowly and sedately. Hence Lad was well pleased to come upon a narrow woodland track, made by a laborer who had passed and repassed through that same strip of forest during the last few hours. To follow in that trampled rut made walking much easier. It was a rut barely wide enough for one wayfarer. More and more like an elderly squire patrolling his acres, Lad rambled along, and presently his ears and his nose told him that his two loving friends, Rex and Wolf, were coming toward him on their homebound way. His plumy tail wagged expectantly. It was growing a bit lonely on this Sunday afternoon walk of his, and a little tired. It would be a pleasure to have company, especially Wolf's. Rex and Wolf had fared ill on their hunt. They had put up 2 rabbits. One had doubled and completely escaped them. And in the chase, Rex had cut his foot nastily on a strip of unseen barbed wire. The sand-like snow had gotten into the jagged cut in a most irritating way. The second rabbit had dived under a log. Rex had thrust his head fiercely through a snowbank in quest of the vanished prey, and a long briar-thorn, hidden there, had plunged its needle-point deep into the inside of his left nostril. The inner nostril is 100-fold the most agonizingly sensitive part of a dog's body, and the pain wrung a yell of rage and hurt from the big dog. With a nostril and a foot both hurt, there was no more fun in hunting, and, angry, cross, savagely in pain, Rex loped homeward, Wolf pattering along behind him. Like Lad, they came upon the laborer's trampled path and took advantage of the easier going. Thus it was, at a turn in the track, that they came face to face with Lad. Wolf had already smelled him, and his brush began to quiver in welcome. Rex, his nose in anguish, could smell nothing. Not until that turn did he know of Lad's presence. He halted, sulky and ill-tempered. The queer restlessness, the pre-springtime savagery that had obsessed him of late, had been brought to a head by his hurts. He was not himself. His mind was sick. There was not room for two large dogs to pass each other in that narrow trail. One or the other must flounder out into the deep snow to the side. Ordinarily, there would be no question about any other dog on the place turning out for Lad. It would have been a matter of course, and so to-day Lad expected it to be. Onward he moved, at that same dignified walk, until he was not a yard away from Rex. The latter, his brain fevered and his hurts torturing him, suddenly flamed into rebellion. Even as a younger buck sooner or later assails for mastery, the leader of the herd, so the brain-sick Rex went back, all at once, to primal instincts. A maniac rage mastered him, the rage of the angry underling, the primitive lust for mastery. With not so much as a growl or warning, he launched himself upon Lad. Straight at the tired old dog's throat he flew. Lad, all unprepared for such unheard-of mutiny, was caught clean off his guard. He had not even time enough to lower his head to protect his throat, or to rear and meet his erstwhile subject's attack halfway. At one moment he had been plodding gravely toward his two supposedly loyal friends. The next, Rex's 90 pounds of whalebone muscle had smitten him violently to earth, and Rex's fearsome jaws, capable of cracking a beef bone as a man cracks a filbert, had found a vice grip in the soft fur of his throat. Down amid a flurry of high-tossed snow crashed Lad, his snarling enemy upon him, pinning him to the ground, the huge jaws tearing and rending at his ruff, the silken ruff that the mistress daily combed with such loving care to keep it fluffy and beautiful. It was a grip and a leverage that would have made the average opponent helpless. With a short-haired dog it would have meant the end. But the providence that gave collies a mattress of fur, to stave off the cold in their herding work amid the snowy moors, has made that fur thickest about the lower neck. Rex had struck in crazy rage, and had not gauged his mark as truly as though he had been cooler. He had missed the jugular and found himself grinding at an enormous mouthful of matted hair, and at very little else. And Lad belonged to the breed that is never to be taken wholly by surprise, and that acts by the swiftest instinct or reason known to dogdom. Even as he fell, he instinctively threw his body sideways to avoid the full jar of Rex's impact, and gathered his feet under him. With a heave that wrenched his every unaccustomed muscle, Lad shook off the living weight and scrambled upright. To prevent this, Rex threw his entire body forward to reinforce his throat grip. As a result, a double handful of rough hair and a patch of skin came away in his jaws, and Lad was free. He was free to turn tail and run for his life from the unequal combat, and that his hero heart would not let him do. He was free also to stand his ground and fight there in the snow-bound forest until he should be slain by his younger and larger and stronger foe. And this folly his almost human intelligence would not permit. There was one chance, and only one compromise alone between sanity and honor, and this chance Lad took. He would not run. He could not save his life by fighting where he stood. His only hope was to keep his face to his enemy, battling as best he could, and all the time keep backing toward home. If he could last until he came within sight or sound of the folk at the house, he knew he would be saved. Home was a full half-mile away, and the snow was almost chest-deep. Yet, on the instant, he laid out his plan of campaign, and put it into action. Rex cleared his mouth of the impeding hair, and flew at Lad once more, before the old dog had fairly gotten to his feet, but not before the line of defense had been thought out. Lad half-wheeled, dodging the snapping jaws by an inch, and taking the impact of the charge on his left shoulder, at the same time burying his teeth in the right side of Rex's face. At the same time Lad gave ground, moving backward 3 or 4 yards, helped along by the impetus of his opponent. Home was a half-mile behind him, in an oblique line, and he could not turn to gauge his direction. Yet he moved in precisely the correct angle. Indeed, a passer-by who witnessed the fight, and the master, who went carefully over the ground afterward, proved that at no point in the battle did Lad swerve or mistake his exact direction. Yet not once could he have been able to look around to judge it, and his footprints showed that not once had he turned his back on the foe. The hold Lad secured on Rex's cheek was good, but it was not good enough. At 13, a dog's biting teeth are worn short and dull, and his yellowed fangs are blunted. Nor is the jaw by any means as powerful as once it was. Rex writhed and pitched in the fierce grip, and presently tore free from it and to the attack again, seeking now to lunge over the top of Lad's lowered head to the vital spot at the nape of the neck, where sharp teeth may pierce through to the spinal cord. Thrice Rex lunged, and thrice Lad reared on his hind legs, meeting the shock with his deep, shaggy breast, snapping and slashing at his enemy, and every time receding a few steps between charges. They had left the path now, and were plowing a course through deep snow. The snow was scant barrier to Rex's full strength, but it terribly impeded the steadily backing Lad. Lad's extra flesh, too, was a bad handicap. His wind was not at all what it should have been, and the unwonted exertion began to tell sharply on him. Under the lead-hued skies and the drive of the snow the fight swirled and eddied. The great dogs reared, clashed, tore, battered against tree trunks, lost footing and rolled, staggered up again, and renewed the onslaught. Ever Lad maneuvered his way backward, waging a desperate rear-guard action. In the battle's wake was an irregular but mathematically straight line of trampled and blood-spattered snow. Oh, but it was slow going, this ever-fighting retreat of Lad's through the deep drifts, with his mightier foe pressing him and rending at his throat and shoulders at every backward step. The old dog's wind was gone. His once superb strength was going, but he fought on with blazing fury, the fury of a dying king who will not be deposed. In sheer skill and brain-work and generalship, Lad was wholly Rex's superior, but these served him ill in a death grapple. With dogs, as with human pugilists, mere science and strategy avail little against superior size and strength and youth. Again and again Lad found or made an opening. Again and again his weakening jaws secured the right grip, only to be shaken off with more and more ease by the younger combatant. Again and again Lad slashed as do his wolf cousins and as does almost no civilized dog but the collie. But the slashes had lost their one-time lightning speed and prowess, and the blunt, rending fangs scored only superficial furrows in Rex's fawn-colored hide. There was meager hope of reaching home alive. Lad must have known that. His strength was gone. It was his heart and his glorious ancestry now that were doing his fighting, not his fat and age-depleted body. From Lad's mental vocabulary the word quit had ever been absent. Wherefore, dizzy, gasping, feebler every minute, he battled fearlessly on in the dying day, never losing his sense of direction, never turning tail, never dreaming of surrender, taking dire wounds, inflicting light ones. There are many forms of dog fight. Two strange dogs, meeting, will fly at each other because their wild forebears used to do so. Jealous dogs will battle even more fiercely. But the deadliest of all canine conflicts is the murder fight. This is a struggle wherein one or both contestants have decided to give no quarter, where the victor will fight on until his antagonist is dead and will then tear his body to pieces. It is a recognized form of canine mania. And it was a murder fight that Rex was waging, for he had gone quite insane. This is wholly different, by the way, from going mad. Down went Lad, for perhaps the 10th time, and once more, though now with an effort that was all but too much for him, he writhed to his feet, gaining 3 yards of ground by the move. Rex was upon him with one leap, the frothing and bloody jaws striking for his mangled throat. Lad reared to block the attack. Then suddenly, overbalanced, he crashed backward into the snowdrift. Rex had not reached him, but young Wolf had. Wolf had watched the battle with a growing excitement that at last had broken all bounds. The instinct which makes a fluff-headed college boy mix into a scrimmage that is no concern of his had suddenly possessed Lad's dearly loved son. Now, if this were a fiction yarn, It would be edifying to tell how Wolf sprang to the aid of his grand old sire, and how he thereby saved Lad's life. But the shameful truth is that Wolf did nothing of the sort. Rex was his model, the bully he had so long and so enthusiastically imitated. And now Rex was fighting a most entertaining bout, fighting it with a maniac fury that infected his young disciple and made him yearn to share in the glory. Wherefore, as Lad reared to meet Rex's lunge, Wolf hurled himself like a furry whirlwind upon the old dog's flank, burying his white teeth in the muscles of the lower leg. The flank attack bowled Lad completely over. There was no chance now for such a fall as would enable him to spring up again unscathed. He was thrown heavily upon his back, and both his murderers plunged at his unguarded throat and lower body. But a collie thrown is not a collie beaten, as perhaps I have said once before. For 30 seconds or more the three thrashed about in the snow in a growling, snarling, right unloving embrace. Then, by some miracle, Lad was on his feet again. His throat had a new and deep wound, perilously close to the jugular. His stomach and left side were slashed as with razor blades. But he was up, and even in that moment of dire stress, with both dogs flinging themselves upon him afresh, he gained another yard or two in his line of retreat. He might have gained still more ground, for his assailants, leaping at the same instant, collided and impeded each other's charge. But for the first time the wise old brain clouded, and the hero heart went sick, as Lad saw his own loved and spoiled son ranged against him in the murder fray. He could not understand. Loyalty was as much a part of himself as were his sorrowful brown eyes or his tiny white forepaws. And Wolf's amazing treachery seemed to numb the old warrior, body and mind. But the second of dumbfounded wonder passed quickly, too quickly for either of the other dogs to take advantage of it. In its place surged a righteous wrath that, for the instant, brought back youth and strength to the aged fighter. With a yell that echoed far through the forest's sinister silence, Lad whizzed forward at the advancing Rex. Wolf, who was nearer, struck for his father's throat, missed, and rolled in the snow from the force of his own momentum. Lad did not heed him. Straight for Rex he leaped. Rex, bounding at him, was already in mid-air. The two met, and under the berserk onset Rex fell back into the snow. Lad was upon him at once. The worn-down teeth found their goal above the jugular. Deep and raggedly they drove, impelled by the brief flash of power that upbore their owner. Almost did that grip end the fight and leave Rex gasping out his life in the drift. But the access of false strength faded. Rex, roaring like a hurt tiger, twisted and tore himself free. Lad, realizing his own bolt was shot, gave ground, backing away from two assailants instead of one. It was easier now to retreat, for Wolf, unskilled in practical warfare, had first hindered Rex almost as much as he helped him, again and again getting in the bigger dog's way and marring a rush. Had Wolf understood teamwork, Lad must have been pulled down and slaughtered in less than a minute. But soon Wolf grasped the fact that he could do worse damage by keeping out of his ally's way and attacking from a different quarter, and thereafter he fought to more deadly purpose. His favorite ruse was to dive for Lad's forelegs and attempt to break one of them. That is a collie maneuver inherited directly from Wolf's namesake ancestors. Several times his jaws reached the slender white forelegs, cutting and slashing them and throwing Lad off his balance. Once he found a hold on the left haunch and held it until his victim shook loose by rolling. Lad defended himself from this new foe as well as he might, by dodging or by brushing him to one side. But never once did he attack Wolf, or so much as snap at him. Rex, after the encounter, was plentifully scarred. Wolf had not so much as a scratch. Backward, with ever-increasing difficulty, the old dog fought his way, often borne down to earth, and always staggering up more feebly than before. But ever he was warring with the same fierce courage, despite an ache and bewilderment in his honest heart at his son's treason. The forest lay behind the fighters. The deserted highroad was passed. Under Lad's clawing and reeling feet was the dear ground of the place where for 13 happy years he had reigned as king. where he had benevolently ruled his kind and had given worshipful service to his gods. But the house was still nearly a furlong off, and Lad was well nigh dead. His body was one mass of wounds. His strength was turned to water. His breath was gone. His bloodshot eyes were dim. His brain was dizzy and refused its office. Loss of blood had weakened him full as much as had the tremendous exertion of the battle. Yet, uselessly now, he continued to fight. It was a grotesquely futile resistance. The other dogs were all over him, tearing, slashing, gripping, at will, unhindered by his puny effort to fend them off. The slaughter time had come. Drunk with blood and fury, the assailants plunged at him for the last time. Down went Lad, helpless beneath the murderous avalanche that overwhelmed him. At this time his body flatly refused to obey the grim command of his will. The fight was over. The good, good fight of a white-souled paladin against hopeless odds. The living-room fire crackled cheerily. The snow hissed and slithered against the glass. A sheet of frost on every pane shut out the stormy twilight world. The screech of the wind was music to the comfortable shut-ins. The mistress drowsed over her book by the fire. Bruce snored snugly in front of the blaze. The master had awakened from his nap and was in the adjoining study, sorting fishing tackle and scouring a rusted hunting knife. Then came a second's lull in the gale, and all at once Bruce was wide awake. Growling, he ran to the front door and scratched imperatively at the panel. This is not the way a well-bred dog makes known his desire to leave the house, and Bruce was decidedly a well-bred dog. The mistress, thinking some guest might be arriving whose scent or tread displeased the collie, called to the master to shut Bruce in the study, lest he insult the supposed visitor by barking. Reluctantly, very reluctantly, Bruce obeyed the order. The master shut the study door behind him and came into the living-room, still carrying the half-clean knife. As no summons at bell or knocker followed Bruce's announcement, the mistress opened the front door and looked out. The dusk was falling, but it was not too dark for her to have seen the approach of anyone, nor was it too dark for the mistress to see two dogs tearing at something that lay hidden from her view in the deep snow 100 yards away. She recognized Rex and Wolf at once, and amusedly wondered with what they were playing. Then from the depth of snow beneath them she saw a feeble head rear itself. A glorious head, though torn and bleeding, a head that waveringly lunged toward Rex's throat. They're killing Lad!" she cried in stark, unbelieving horror. Forgetful of thin dress and thinner slippers, she ran toward the trio. Halfway to the battlefield the master passed by her, running and lurching through the knee-high snow at something like record speed. She heard his shout, and at sound of it she saw Wolf slink away from the slaughter like a scared schoolboy. But Rex was too far gone in murder lust to heed the shout. The master seized him by the studded collar and tossed him 10 feet or more to one side. Rage-blind, Rex came flying back to the kill. The master stood astride his prey, and in his blind mania the crossbreed sprang at the man. The master's hunting knife caught him squarely behind the left foreleg, and with a grunt like the sound of an exhausted soda siphon, the huge dog passed out of this story and out of life as well. There would be ample time later for the master to mourn his enforced slaying of the pet dog that he had loved and served him so long. At present he had eyes only for the torn and senseless body of Lad, lying huddled in the red-blotched snow. In his arms he lifted Lad and carried him tenderly into the house. There the mistress's light fingers dressed his hideous injuries. Not less than 36 deep wounds scored the worn-out old body. Several of these were past the skill of home treatment. A grumbling veterinary was summoned on the telephone, and was lured by pledge of a triple fee to chug through 10 miles of storm in a balky car to the rescue. Lad was lying with his head in the mistress's lap. The vet looked the unconscious dog over, and then said tersely, "I wished I'd stayed at home. He's as good as dead." "He's a million times better than dead," denied the master. "I know Lad. You don't. He's got into the habit of living, and he's not going to break that habit. Not if the best nursing and surgery in the state keep him from doing it. Get busy." "There's nothing to keep me here," objected the vet. "There's everything to keep you here," gently contradicted the master. "You'll stay here till Lad's out of danger. If I have to steal your trousers and your car, you're going to cure him. And if you do, you can write your bill on the Liberty Bond." 2 hours later Lad opened his eyes. He was swathed in smelly bandages, and he was soaked in liniments. Patches of hair had been shaved away from his worst wounds. Digitalis was reinforcing his faint heart action. He looked up at the mistress with his only available eye. By a Herculean struggle he wagged his tail, just once, and he essayed the trumpeting bark wherewith he always welcomed her return after an absence. The bark was a total failure. After which Lad tried to tell the mistress the story of the battle. Very weakly, but very persistently he talked. His tones dropped now and then to the shadow of a ferocious growl as he related his exploits, and then scaled again to a puppy-like whimper. He had done a grand day's work, had Lad, and he wanted applause. He had suffered much, and he was still in racking pain, and he wanted sympathy and petting. Presently he fell asleep. It was 2 weeks before Lad could stand upright, and 2 more before he could go out of doors unhelped. Then on a warm, early spring morning the vet declared him out of all danger. Very thin was the invalid, very shaky, snow-white of muzzle, and with the air of an old man whose too fragile body is sustained only by a regal dignity, but he was alive. Slowly he marched from his piano cave toward the open front door. Wolf, in black disgrace for the past month, chanced to be crossing the living room toward the veranda at the same time. The 2 dogs reached the doorway simultaneously. Very respectfully, almost cringingly, Wolf stood aside for Lad to pass out. His sire walked by with never a look, but his step was all at once stronger and springier, and he held his splendid head high, for Lad knew he was still king. The End. End of Chapter 12. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida. Afterword of Lad, a Dog by Albert Payson Terhune. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Greg Giordano. Afterword. The stories of Lad in various magazines found unexpectedly kind welcome. Letters came to me from soldiers and sailors in Europe, from hosts of children, from men and women everywhere. Few of the letter writers bothered to praise the stories themselves, but all of them praised Lad, which pleased me far better, and more than 100 of them wanted to know if he were a real dog, and if the tales of his exploits were true. Perhaps those of you who have followed Lad's adventures through these pages may also be a little interested to know more about him. Yes, Lad was a real dog, the greatest dog by far I have known or shall know. And the chief happenings in nearly all of my Lad stories are absolutely true. This accounts for such measure of success as the stories may have won. After his day of battle, Lad lived for more than 2 years, still gallant of spirit, loyally mighty of heart, uncanny of wisdom, still the undisputed king of the place's little people. Then, on a warm September morning in 1918, he stretched himself to sleep in the coolest and shadiest corner of the veranda. And, while he slept, his great heart very quietly stopped beating. He had no pain, no illness, none of the distressing features of extreme age. He had lived out a full span of 16 years, years rich in life and happiness and love. Surely there was nothing in such a death to warrant the silly grief that was ours, nor the heartsick gloom that overhung the place. It was wholly illogical, not to say maudlin. I admit that without argument. The cleric author of The Mansion Yard must have known the same miserable sense of loss, I think, when he wrote, "Stretched on the hearth rug in a deep content, fond of the fire as I. Oh, there was something with the old dog went, I had not thought could die." We buried Lad in a sunlit nook that had been his favorite lounging place, close to the house he had guarded so long and so gallantly. With him we buried his honorary Red Cross and Blue Cross, awards for money raised in his name. Above his head we set a low granite block, with a carven line or two thereon. The mistress wanted the block inscribed, "The dearest dog." I suggested, "The dog God made." But we decided against both epitaphs. We did not care to risk making our dear old friend's memory ridiculous by words at which saner folk might one day sneer. So on the granite is engraved, "Lad, thoroughbred in body and soul." Some people are wise enough to know that a dog has no soul. These will find ample theme for mirth in our foolish inscription. But no one, who knew Lad, will laugh at it. Albert Payson Terhune, Sunnybank, Pompton Lakes, New Jersey. End of Afterword. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida. End of Lad, a Dog by Albert Payson Terhune.